Tonight, we're stepping back into a world that shaped the course of history for nearly 1,000 years. The world of feudalism. A time when kings ruled by divine right, knights lived and died by their oaths, and peasants worked the land beneath the shadow of stone castles. In this story, you'll wander through villages and manors, hear the bells of medieval churches, and feel what it was truly like to live under the order that defined the Middle Ages. From the quiet toil of the fields to the echoing halls of the lords, from the faith that held people together to the cracks that finally broke the system apart, this series will take you deep into the heart of medieval life, seen through the eyes of those who lived it. Welcome to History to Relax, where we slow down time and let the past unfold in calm, vivid detail. If you enjoy these long, peaceful journeys through history, please take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and tell us in the comments where in the world you're listening from. It truly helps our little community grow and keeps these stories alive. Now find a comfortable place to sit back and unwind. Take a deep breath and let your mind drift to another age as we begin our journey, Life Under Feudalism. Part 1. The Web of Obligation. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine a world where time moves with the seasons rather than the clock. A world without the hum of engines, without glass windows or street lamps. The world you're entering is the world of feudalism, the great web of land, loyalty, and faith that held much of Europe together for nearly 1,000 years. It began after the great collapse of Rome, when empires vanished and protection became a private matter. Roads fell into ruin, towns shrank, and life retreated into small circles of trust. Without armies or emperors to guarantee safety, people turned to whoever could defend them. That is how feudalism took root, not as a plan, but as a series of promises. At its heart was the exchange of need. A lord offered protection, land, and justice. In return, his vassals and peasants gave him work, service, and loyalty. It was a system built not on coins or contracts, but on oaths spoken aloud and sealed by faith. Those oaths formed the invisible threads that bound one person to another, from the mightiest king to the humblest serf. Life under this system was not simple. It was a vast pyramid of duties, each person owing something to someone above and receiving something from someone below. The system reached from the crowned head of a monarch down to the barefoot laborer who turned the soil. Every village, every castle, every monastery was a tiny world with its own rules, yet all were part of the same design, a web of obligation that seemed, at the time, as natural as the sunrise. Picture a small valley at dawn. Mist clings to the meadows, and the bell of a distant church rings softly through the cold air. In the fields, peasants begin their work, guided by the rhythm of the seasons. Above them, on the hill, stands a stone castle, surrounded by wooden palisades. Inside those walls lives the local lord, perhaps not rich by our standards, but powerful within his narrow domain. He commands soldiers, collects rents, and dispenses judgment. His word is law in a world that has little written law left. The castle is not only a home, it is a symbol of order in a landscape still haunted by memories of war and chaos. Around it cluster the huts of those who depend on it. The peasants work the lord's land in exchange for protection from raiders and bandits. The blacksmith mends plows and weapons. The miller grinds the grain. The priest keeps the souls of all in his prayers. Each person belongs to their place, tied to the land and to one another. This deep sense of belonging was both security and prison. For a peasant, freedom was rare and movement was dangerous. Most people were born and died within sight of the same fields. Their lives were woven into the soil like roots. They could not leave without permission. Yet they found meaning in the familiar rhythm of sowing and harvest, in the comfort of knowing their role in the pattern of life. For the lords and nobles, feudalism meant responsibility as much as privilege. Their wealth came from land, and land meant people. To lose those people was to lose power. A wise lord protected his peasants as carefully as he guarded his cattle or his grain. In return, they tilled his fields, built his walls, and answered his call when danger came. Above the local lords stood greater powers, counts, dukes, and kings, each bound by layers of vassalage. A knight might swear fealty to a baron, the baron to a duke, and the duke to a king. Each oath involved ceremony. The vassal would kneel, place his hands between those of his lord, and promise loyalty. The lord would raise him up and grant a fief, a portion of land that came with rights and duties. This ritual was called homage, and it carried a sacred weight. Breaking such an oath was not merely betrayal, it was sin. Yet, for all its solemnity, the system was fragile. It relied on personal trust rather than institutions. If a lord failed to protect his vassals, or if a vassal defied his lord, the chain could break. Civil wars, rival claims, and shifting loyalties were constant shadows. Still, for centuries, people believed that this arrangement reflected the divine order. The world was unequal because heaven itself was unequal. God ruled over angels and men, kings ruled over subjects, lords over peasants. To question the hierarchy was to question creation itself. The church gave feudalism its moral backbone. Priests and monks taught that obedience was a path to salvation. They reminded the poor that their suffering mirrored the humility of Christ, and that patience on earth would be rewarded in heaven. The same message comforted the lords, who saw their rule as part of God's design. If they were just, they were righteous. If they were cruel, confession could cleanse their souls. Thus, faith kept the machine turning even when justice faltered. In this world, time was measured by bells and by nature. Days began with the first light of dawn, marked by the Angelus bell. Work followed the sun, tilling, sowing, reaping, and resting. Seasons dictated survival. Spring meant hope, summer meant toil, autumn meant harvest, and winter meant endurance. The year was a circle rather than a line, and every person walked it from birth to death without ever stepping outside it. A child born into a peasant family learned early that the earth was both master and friend. Fields had to be plowed before the rains, and grain had to be stored before the frost. Hunger was never far away. In good years, the Lord's barns were full and feasts were held in the great hall. In bad years, the same hall echoed with prayers for mercy. For nobles, life was more comfortable but rarely easy. Castles were cold, smoky, and damp. Servants tended fires, cooks worked in stone kitchens, and guards patrolled the ramparts. A noble family's days revolved around management of the estate, diplomacy with neighboring lords, and the endless small wars that flared across the countryside. Even the highest baron could not escape the need to defend his land. Feudal warfare was personal and limited. Knights fought not for conquest but for honor or debt. A feud between two families might burn for generations, yet battles were often small, fought by a few hundred men at most. The true terror came from raiders and mercenaries who left villages burned and fields empty. For the peasants, the outcome of such violence was always the same, rebuilding what others had destroyed. Despite the hardship, life under feudalism was filled with ritual and community. Festivals marked the calendar. The churchyard became the center of social life. Weddings, baptisms, and saints' days brought color to otherwise gray existence. Music echoed from wooden pipes and drums. Mead flowed in cups of clay. People danced on worn earth beneath the gaze of their lord's tower. In those moments, the boundaries between high and low blurred just enough to remind everyone that they shared the same sky. The idea of ownership was different from ours. Few thought of land as a possession that could be freely bought or sold. Land was a trust, a sacred inheritance tied to duty. The Lord held it from the king, the peasant from the Lord, and the church from God. Every grant of land carried an expectation. Defend it, cultivate it, or pray for it. Even kings, at least in theory, held their crowns by the grace of heaven rather than by right. What held it all together was the understanding that no one stood alone. Isolation was death. To survive, each person had to play their part. The knight guarding the road, the farmer feeding the manor, the monk recording the harvest. In that sense, feudalism was not only a political system, but a worldview. It defined how people saw themselves in relation to others and to the divine. It was also a deeply local world. Most people had little idea what lay beyond the next valley. Maps were rare, roads dangerous. To travel meant to risk hunger, robbery, or worse. Yet stories still flowed from one place to another, of saints, of kings, of faraway wars and miracles. These tales gave meaning to the isolation, reminding villagers that they were part of a greater story written by God. As centuries passed, this system became both stronger and more brittle. The bonds of loyalty grew formal. The language of law replaced the language of promise. Feudalism hardened into habit. Lords inherited not only land, but the weight of expectation. Peasants inherited not only their fathers' fields, but their burdens. And still the web held, generation after generation, believing it could never unravel. Standing within that web, a person's identity was defined by rank, not ambition. A man might be a serf, a free tenant, a craftsman, or a knight, but rarely anything else. Birth fixed one's place. Social mobility was almost unknown. To rise above one's station was seen as prideful, even dangerous. Yet within those boundaries, people found dignity. A good plowman was respected for his skill, a loyal vassal for his courage, a wise abbot for his piety. To modernize, the feudal world may seem harsh and suffocating. Yet to those who lived within it, it offered structure and purpose. In a time when famine or war could strike without warning, belonging to a lord's domain meant belonging to something stable. The promise of protection, even imperfect, was worth obedience. As twilight falls over our imagined valley, torches flicker along the walls of the castle. The peasants return from the fields, their tools on their shoulders. Smoke rises from hearths. Somewhere a priest chants evening prayers in Latin, words most cannot understand but all can feel. The sound mingles with the lowing of cattle and the sighing of wind across the fields. The world settles into its nightly rhythm, one of duty, gratitude, and weary peace. This was feudalism not as theory, but as life. A tapestry of fear and faith, labor and loyalty, all woven together by the belief that every person, no matter how small, had a place within God's design. The Lord ruled by divine right, the peasant worked by divine will, and the church stood between them as both mediator and judge. When morning came, the pattern would repeat. The bell would toll, fields would beckon, oaths would hold, and somewhere, another child would be born into the web, unaware that centuries later, people would look back and call this age the backbone of medieval Europe. For those who lived it, it was simply life. Part 2. The Great Chain of Being. To understand the medieval world, you must imagine a society that believed everything, from the stars above to the worms beneath the soil, had its place in a vast, unbreakable order. People did not see themselves as individuals first, but as links in a divine chain. This was called the Great Chain of Being, a vision of existence that shaped how everyone lived, prayed, and obeyed. At the top of the chain stood God, perfect and eternal. Beneath him were the angels, ranked in shining hierarchies of their own, archangels, dominions, thrones, cherubim, and seraphim. Below them came humanity, arranged as carefully as the heavens. Kings stood closest to the divine light, for they ruled by God's will. Beneath kings came nobles, then knights, clergy, freemen, peasants, and finally, animals and the inanimate world. Every creature had a role to play. Every stone, every leaf, every breath was thought to exist according to this sacred design. This idea was not born in a single moment. It came from centuries of philosophy, stretching back to the ancient Greeks, refined by Christian thinkers like Augustine and Aquinas. To the medieval mind, it was not theory, but truth. visible proof that creation was balanced. The world's inequalities were not accidents, they were reflections of the order of heaven. If a man was born poor, it was because God had placed him where humility and labor could shape his soul. If another was born noble, it was because God had chosen him to protect and guide. Questioning one's station was like questioning the shape of the sun or the rhythm of the seasons. The great chain held fast, and in its stability people found comfort. In every village church, paintings and carvings reinforced this hierarchy. On stained glass windows, saints knelt below angels, and peasants knelt below saints. The king's seal carried a cross above his crown, and even the smallest chapel altar placed the priest above the congregation. Power flowed downward, grace upward, and between the two lay obedience. It is hard for us today to grasp how deeply this belief penetrated daily life. It governed how people spoke, dressed, and moved. A peasant bowed before a knight not only out of fear, but because the act reflected the divine order. A wife obeyed her husband as the church obeyed Christ. Children honored parents because God was Father of all. The smallest gestures of respect were echoes of a cosmic rhythm that bound heaven to earth. The church gave this worldview its language and ceremony. Every sermon, every hymn, and every procession reminded believers that they were part of something larger than themselves. In cathedrals that seemed to touch the sky, they saw the very shape of the hierarchy made stone, towering spires rising toward God, narrow aisles channeling the faithful upward from shadow to light. Monks copied texts that explained how angels governed stars, how kings ruled nations, and how the poor sustained both with their work. The idea that one class could not exist without the others became a moral foundation. The strong protected the weak served the strong, and all prayed for each other's salvation. That interdependence was seen as holy balance, not oppression. For the Lord in his hall, this belief confirmed his authority. He could look across his fields and see not merely workers, but souls entrusted to him. His duty was to protect them from harm, to administer justice, and to ensure their spiritual care. If he failed, his sin was great, for to neglect one's vassals or peasants was to disturb the chain itself. For the peasant in his field, the same belief offered meaning. The endless labor, the hunger, the submission, all these could be endured if they served a divine purpose. Life was hard, but heaven promised peace. The church bells that marked the hours of work also marked the hours of prayer, blending sweat with devotion. This harmony between faith and structure was not perfect, but it was persuasive. When rebellion arose, priests reminded people that Lucifer had rebelled too. Pride was the greatest sin because it threatened to unmake the world's order. To accept one's place was not weakness, it was virtue. Imagine a Sunday morning in a small manor parish. The people gather in a stone church with smoke from candles curling toward the roof beams. The air smells of beeswax and damp wool. The Lord's family sits closest to the altar, the peasants behind them, the children on the floor. The priest speaks in Latin, his voice echoing through the nave. Few understand his words, but all feel their weight. They kneel together, repeating the gestures of humility that have bound their ancestors for generations. Outside, sunlight falls on the fields, on the manor house, and on the grazing cattle. Each scene seems part of one great painting. Even the birds wheeling above the towers fit within the divine pattern. There is beauty in that stillness, a beauty born of certainty. The great chain of being also shaped law and justice. Crimes were seen not simply as offenses against people, but as disruptions of divine balance. To steal from a lord was to defy the order that God had set. To lie in court or to rebel against one's superior was to mirror the pride of fallen angels. Punishment, then, was not only retribution, it was restoration of harmony. When a serf was tried before his lord, he stood not merely before a man, but before the earthly reflection of God's hierarchy. The Lord's judgment, when just, restored peace to the manor. When unjust, it was said that heaven itself would avenge it. Faith ensured that even injustice could be endured with hope. This belief extended into the smallest customs. Clothing marked status. Bright dyes and furs for nobles, plain wool and linen for commoners. Sumptuary laws enforced this separation, forbidding certain colors or fabrics to those of lower rank. At feasts, seating followed the same invisible ladder. The lord and lady at the high table, the steward below, the servants at the door. In every gesture, the chain was visible. Even language reflected hierarchy. To address one's superior improperly could be an insult worthy of punishment. Words like "my lord," "my lady," or "your grace" reminded both speaker and listener of their roles. Courtesy was not merely politeness, it was theology in practice. Yet within this order, there was room for compassion. The same faith that taught obedience also taught charity. The wealthy were expected to give alms, to feed the hungry, to clothe the poor. Acts of mercy balanced the harshness of the system. The chain was firm but not heartless. When famine struck, the church organized relief. When war came, it offered sanctuary. Even lords, hardened by conflict, might endow monasteries to cleanse their souls and ease the suffering of those below them. The monastic life itself was another reflection of divine order. Within the monastery walls, monks lived by strict hierarchies, mirroring those of the outside world. The abbot ruled, the prior advised, the brothers worked and prayed. Hours were marked by bells, duties by obedience. The abbey was a microcosm of creation, silent, ordered, and devoted to balance. Scholars debated the structure of heaven as carefully as architects designed the arches of cathedrals. In their writings, they described 9 orders of angels, 7 virtues, 7 sins, and the hierarchy of grace descending through saints to humankind. Such exactness gave shape to mystery, turning the unknown into something intelligible and reassuring. It is easy to see why people accepted this worldview. It explained suffering, provided stability, and connected the visible and invisible worlds. The great chain of being made life coherent. Even the poorest man could look up at the stars and feel part of the same design that moved them. But this order was not without its tensions. Ambition still stirred hearts, and the reality of power often clashed with its ideal. A cruel lord might exploit his tenants. A corrupt bishop might sell forgiveness. When the chain was strained, people sought renewal in reform movements, in pilgrimage, or in rebellion disguised as righteousness. The idea of divine order remained, but its earthly execution was always flawed. Still, the belief endured for centuries because it gave people a sense of belonging that modern minds often envy. No one was entirely alone. The chain connected every being, every soul, every moment. Birth, labor, and death were threads in a single tapestry stretching from the throne of God to the humblest cottage. In winter evenings, as fires burned low, old men told children that even stars were held in place by invisible bonds of obedience. They said that angels guided the wind and that each person's breath joined a song that never ceased. Such stories comforted those who had little else to claim. The universe, though vast and cruel, was also home. As centuries passed, thinkers would question this cosmic order. Merchants grew rich, cities expanded, and the idea of worth began to shift from birth to skill. Yet in the age of feudalism, the great chain of being remained the unseen spine of civilization. It justified the crown, sanctified the sword, and gave meaning to the plow. At dusk, when the fields lay quiet and the bell of Compline echoed across the valley, the people of that world could rest in certainty. They believed that above them stretched a ladder of light rising to heaven, and beneath them the solid ground of duty and belonging. Between those two, their lives unfolded like verses in a long, unchanging hymn. The great chain of being was not merely an idea. It was the air they breathed, the invisible rhythm that told them who they were, where they stood, and how the world held together. Part 3. The Castle on the Hill. High above the valley, where the wind moves like a living thing across the stone, rises the fortress of a medieval lord. To those who look up from the fields below, the castle is more than a building. It is power made visible, a symbol of safety for some and of fear for others. From its towers, banners ripple against the gray sky. From its gatehouse, a watchman peers over the countryside, scanning for smoke or riders. This is the heart of feudal life, the seat of authority and the echo of the ancient warrior past. Yet a castle was never only a military structure. It was also a home, a court, and a community in itself. Inside its walls, dozens of lives unfolded. Nobles, soldiers, servants, craftsmen, children, and priests. Each followed a rhythm of duty and rest that mirrored the order of the land beyond its gates. The first thing that strikes you as you imagine stepping inside is the sound. Hooves on cobblestones, the clang of metal, the calls of workers and guards. Somewhere, a blacksmith hammers a horseshoe in the forge. In the kitchens, water boils in great iron pots, and the smell of roasting meat mixes with smoke from the hearth. Every corner of the castle breathes activity. At dawn, the gates creak open to admit farmers bringing in produce, hunters returning from the woods, or messengers from neighboring estates. The courtyard fills with the rhythm of daily life. Chickens wander between barrels and carts, dogs bark near the stables, a page hurries past carrying a bundle of spears. For those who live here, this is ordinary, the pulse of a small world enclosed by stone. Within the great hall, the lord holds court. The hall is the heart of the castle, vast, smoky, and echoing with voices. Light filters through narrow slits in the walls, softened by tapestries that tell stories of battles and saints. A long wooden table runs the length of the room, polished by years of use. Above it hangs the lord's coat of arms, bright against the gloom. Here, the lord eats, hears petitions, and dispenses justice. His authority flows outward from this room to every field and village he owns. When disputes arise, a question of land boundaries, a theft, or a marriage contract, they are settled beneath the carved beams of this hall. To stand before the Lord is to stand before the embodiment of the feudal system itself. The lady of the castle moves through a different world within the same walls. She oversees the household, manages servants, and ensures supplies are kept through winter. Her duties are vast and constant. Linen must be washed and stored, herbs must be dried, candles must be made, and medicines prepared for the sick. In her chambers, women spin wool and embroider garments while talking softly of family, births, and saints. Children grow up in this ordered space. The sons of nobles train early for knighthood, learning to ride, hunt, and serve. They begin as pages, running errands and learning manners before becoming squires under the guidance of a knight. The girls, meanwhile, are taught music, sewing, reading of psalms, and the management of a household. Their lives are guided by duty as firmly as their fathers' lives are guided by honor. Every castle was designed not only for comfort, but for defense. Thick walls, narrow staircases, and high towers made it a place of refuge during war. Arrow slits allowed defenders to fire without exposure. A drawbridge could rise, a portcullis could drop, and an entire population could be sealed safely inside. From the battlements, guards could see for miles, rivers glinting in the distance, forests dark and deep, and smoke from nearby villages marking life in the domain. In peaceful times, the castle stood as a beacon of authority. Its chapel bells marked the hours. Travelers looked for its shape on the horizon as a sign that law still ruled the land. Pilgrims were given bread and shelter within its outer court. The Lord's hospitality, though expected, was also a statement of virtue. Generosity proved his worth as protector. Inside the chapel, mornings begin with Mass. The Lord, his family, and his retainers gather before a small stone altar. Candles flicker, and the priest's voice rises in Latin prayers. The sound of chanting echoes off the cold walls. For a moment, the hierarchy of the castle dissolves as everyone kneels together before God. Then the service ends and rank returns. The The Lord leads the procession out first, followed by his knights and family, then the servants. Even worship followed the order of feudal life. After Mass, the day divides. The Lord may ride out to inspect his lands or meet his steward to discuss rents and harvests. Messengers bring reports from tenants, news from the king's court, or letters sealed with wax. The steward records transactions, manages labor, and ensures that tithes owed to the church are delivered on time. In a world where paper was rare, memory and trust were everything. Meals punctuate the day with ceremony. The midday meal is a communal event. Servants lay out trenchers, flat pieces of stale bread used as plates. Dishes of meat, vegetables, and stews are carried in. The lord and lady sit at the high table while others dine in order of rank. Before eating, a blessing is spoken. Between courses, the minstrel sings or a bard recites tales of heroes. Food is plentiful but often simple. Bread, ale, cheese, and salted meat. Spices from the east are rare treasures saved for feasts. In the evening, the hall glows with the light of torches and the warmth of the hearth. The lord might entertain guests with music or discuss alliances with visiting knights. Conversation drifts between war, faith, and rumor. Outside, the night grows cold and the castle settles into watchful silence. Guards patrol the ramparts. The smell of smoke and straw fills the air. The world beyond the walls fades into darkness. To live within a castle was to exist in a state of balance between luxury and hardship, peace and preparation, faith and fear. For all its strength, stone was never truly safe. Siege, fire, or famine could strike without warning. That awareness shaped the mood of castle life. Even during calm years, the lord's household trained for war, stockpiled food, and maintained alliances. Yet the castle was also a place of beauty. Courtyards bloomed with herbs and roses, tapestries covered the walls to keep out drafts and to tell stories of valor. Music echoed from lutes and harps, dogs slept by the fire, and laughter could be heard from the kitchen late at night. Within the limits of their age, the people of the castle found comfort and even joy. When a feast day arrived, the entire manor celebrated. Tables were set with roasted boar, pastries, and sweetmeats. Jesters performed, jugglers entertained, and wine flowed freely. For one night, the boundaries between lord and servant softened. Everyone shared the same warmth, the same songs, the same exhaustion when the candles burned low. In those moments, the castle became not just a fortress but a living heart of the community. The architecture of a castle was designed to inspire awe. From the great gatehouse to the tallest keep, every feature carried meaning. The keep, the central tower, symbolized endurance. It was the final refuge in time of war and the visible mark of the lord's strength. The curtain walls showed the extent of his power, while the moat reminded outsiders of the price of defiance. Even the smallest detail, a carved doorway, a shield, a banner, declared ownership and lineage. To the peasants below, the castle was a world apart. They saw it rise like a mountain of stone and believed it would stand forever. During times of danger, they sought its shelter, crowding within its outer bailey with their families and animals. From its gates came commands, judgments, and sometimes mercy. It loomed over their lives as both protector and master. For the Lord himself, it was a burden as much as a privilege. Every stone represented responsibility. The castle had to be maintained, garrisoned, and supplied. Its safety depended on loyalty, from the steward who managed the stores, from the knights who defended the walls, and from the peasants who worked the land. To neglect any link in that chain was to risk ruin. Still, the castle stood as a kind of dream made solid. It turned fear into form, chaos into order. Within its walls, generations were born, married, and buried. The echoes of their lives lingered long after their names faded. At sunset, when the day's work was done, the valley below glowed with the light of small fires. From the castle tower, the lord could see every flicker of those hearths. Each represented a family who owed him service and who, in turn, depended on his protection. The landscape was a living map of obligation. Night deepened. The last bell of the day rang from the chapel tower, marking Compline, the hour of final prayer. Servants crossed themselves and withdrew to their quarters. In the Lord's chamber, candles burned low as the priest read from a small book of psalms. The wind sighed through narrow windows. Somewhere beyond the walls, a wolf howled in the forest. Inside, the fire crackled softly, and the castle slept. For those who lived there, the castle was the world, secure yet fragile, powerful yet bound by duty. It was a reflection of feudal life itself, disciplined, enclosed, and sustained by faith. Every day began and ended with the same awareness that order was precious and must be guarded like the flame in a winter storm. When morning came, the bell would sound again, the gates would open, and the cycle of life on the hill would begin anew. Part 4. The Lord's Demesne. When you stand on the hill beside a castle and look down over the valley, the landscape is not just earth and trees. It is an entire system of loyalty and survival. Every field, every hedgerow, every plowed furrow belongs to someone, and all of it fits into the pattern that holds feudal life together. The land is the foundation of the world, the one resource that can feed, clothe, and sustain. In the age of feudalism, it was also the measure of power. The Lord's domain, known as the Demesne, stretched outward from his castle like the spokes of a great wheel. It was the heart of his wealth and the proof of his authority. The word came from the Latin dominium, meaning ownership, but it meant more than possession. It was responsibility. A man might inherit titles and armor, but without land, he was nothing. To control land was to control life itself. The Demesne was divided carefully. Part of it was reserved for the Lord's own use, the meadows that fed his horses, the orchards that supplied his table, the fields whose harvest filled his granaries. The rest was worked by the peasants who lived on his estate. Some were free tenants who paid rent, but most were serfs, bound to the soil by law and tradition. They could not leave without permission, yet they were not slaves. They had homes, families, and rights recognized by custom, though not by freedom. Each year began with the rhythm of planting. In early spring, the Lord's bailiff, his trusted overseer, would summon the villagers to meet in the open field. There, under the gray sky, tasks were divided. The Demesne fields came first. The peasants were required to give part of their labor to the Lord before tending their own strips of land. It was a duty known as corvée, unpaid work owed as part of their tenancy. On those days, the village moved as one. Men guided heavy plows drawn by oxen through thick soil. Women and children followed behind, scattering seed and repairing fences. The bailiff rode along the rows on horseback, keeping order and ensuring that each man fulfilled his obligation. The work was hard and endless, but it bound the people to one another as much as to their master. In summer, the fields shimmered with wheat and barley. The Lord's steward calculated yields, preparing lists of how much would go to the manor, how much to the church as tithe, and how much might be left for sale or barter. Every ear of grain mattered. A poor harvest meant hunger, and hunger meant unrest. A good harvest brought feasts and repairs, but never complacency. The balance between plenty and famine was always fragile. The Demesne also included pasture, woodland, and waste, each vital in its own way. Pasture fed the Lord's sheep and cattle. Woodland provided timber for building, firewood for heat, and game for the table. The waste, seemingly barren land was often used for grazing pigs or gathering peat. Even the smallest patch of ground held value. Nothing was truly wild. Every tree and stream had an owner. The peasants' own plots were scattered among the Lord's land in narrow strips. This arrangement ensured fairness. Each family received a share of good and poor soil alike, but it also kept them dependent. To reach their fields, they often had to cross the Lord's property. Every harvest, a portion of what they grew was owed as rent in kind, sacks of grain, baskets of vegetables, or barrels of ale. In return, they could live on the land, use its resources, and seek the Lord's protection. The manor's economy was a closed circle. Money was scarce. Most trade was barter. The Lord provided tools, animals, and seed, and the peasants repaid him in labor or goods. The blacksmith mended plows and shod horses. The miller ground the grain, taking a portion as his fee. The carpenter built carts, and the reeve, a respected peasant chosen to represent the villagers, kept watch over their duties. Everyone's work fed into the same rhythm of dependence and reward. On the edge of the Demesne stood the manor house, where the Lord's steward kept records. Inside, shelves held rolls of parchment marked with careful script, lists of tenants, rents, and harvest yields. Wax seals hung from some, proof of agreements made before witnesses. The steward's chamber smelled of ink, wax, and wool. In a world where few could read, he was the keeper of memory. Justice, too, flowed from the land. The manorial court met at intervals to settle disputes about boundaries, debts, or broken oaths. The lord or his steward presided, seated on a wooden chair beneath a tapestry bearing the family arms. Villagers stood before him, hats in hand, waiting their turn. The court's authority came from custom, not written law. To the people of the manor, it was as ancient as the soil itself. Life on the Demesne followed the seasons with a precision that feels almost timeless. In spring, fields were sown. In summer, hay was cut and stored. Autumn brought the harvest, long days of reaping, binding, and threshing. Winter was for mending tools, tending animals, and praying for mild weather. The rhythm never changed. Each generation inherited both the land and the cycle that sustained it. At the center of all this stood the Lord himself, master, judge, and protector. Though his wealth came from others' labor, he was not idle. His duties were constant, defending his lands, maintaining order, and answering to his own liege. A good lord was expected to show fairness and generosity. On feast days, he opened his hall to his tenants, offering bread and ale. When famine struck, he might forgive part of their dues or release grain from his stores. His reputation depended not only on his power, but on his mercy. The church reminded him of this at every turn. Priests preached that a lord's soul was bound to the welfare of his people. To oppress them was to invite damnation. To rule them wisely was to mirror God's justice. Many lords founded chapels or granted land to monasteries as acts of piety. In doing so, they hoped to balance their worldly authority with spiritual grace. For the peasants, the Demesne was both burden and anchor. It gave them stability in a world of uncertainty. They could see their toil rise as crops, their obedience reflected in peace. Though they labored for another's profit, they also shared in his protection. Bandits, famine, and war were constant threats. Behind the manor's system lay the promise of safety. Daily life on the land was full of small, enduring details. At dawn, smoke rose from thatched cottages as families ate coarse bread and broth before heading to the fields. Tools were carried on shoulders, voices echoed across the meadows, and children chased geese through the mud. The air smelled of earth, sweat, and the faint sweetness of hay. At midday, work paused for a simple meal. By dusk, the fields grew quiet again, save for the caw of rooks and the sound of a distant bell calling to prayer. Evenings belonged to community. Villagers gathered by hearths to mend clothes, tell stories, and share ale. News traveled slowly, carried by peddlers or wandering friars. In those hours of rest, laughter mixed with fatigue. They spoke of births, deaths, and weather, the things that truly measured time. The Lord's castle, visible on the horizon, was both their ruler and their reassurance. Its lights glimmered like stars of order in the night. The structure of obligation that bound the Demesne was intricate but clear. The Lord owed service to his king, military support, taxes, and loyalty. His knights owed service to him in turn, often granted small fiefs within his lands in exchange for armed readiness. Beneath them, the peasants owed labor and goods. This pyramid of duty created stability but also rigidity. Every person's life was defined by what they owed and to whom they owed it. Feudal documents sometimes describe the manor as a little kingdom. It had its own fields, courts, roads, and defenses. The lord was its sovereign, yet he ruled under the shadow of higher powers, his king above and the church beside. This constant tension shaped the medieval landscape. Power was local, but faith was universal. The Demesne stood at the point where those forces met. To walk its fields was to move through history in slow motion. Centuries could pass with little visible change. The same plow paths cut through the same soil, the same songs rose during harvest, the same prayers were whispered at dusk. When a lord died, his heir took his place. When a peasant passed, his son inherited both his home and his duties. The land remembered them all, holding the marks of their work like lines on an old face. The economy of the manor was not designed for growth, but for endurance. Its goal was balance, not expansion. Wealth came from steadiness, not ambition. A single poor season could undo years of labor. That fragility made the bonds between lord and peasant essential. Without the peasant's hands, the land lay idle. Without the lord's protection, the peasants faced chaos. Each depended utterly on the other. During times of crisis, war, plague, or famine, these ties were tested. Refugees might crowd the manor's lands seeking food and safety. The lord's granaries would empty faster than they could be refilled. The peasants might whisper prayers for mercy as they buried the dead and began again. Yet even then, the pattern survived. The Demesne endured because people had no choice but to keep it alive. By candlelight in the steward's chamber, the records grew longer. New births were added, new debts noted, new agreements sealed. The web of obligation expanded, thread by thread. For the people who lived within it, life was a mixture of hardship and purpose. Their labor fed others, but it also gave meaning to their own days. At sunset, when the fields turned gold and shadows stretched across the furrows, the sound of distant bells carried over the hills. The peasants gathered their tools, walking home along rutted paths. Behind them lay the Demesne, glowing softly in the fading light. The castle stood watch above it all, silent and enduring. To live in that world was to understand that land was not simply property. It was identity, destiny, and faith combined. The Lord's Demesne was the stage on which every life unfolded, from the wealthiest knight to the poorest plowman. It was the soil that shaped their bodies and their beliefs, binding them into one unbroken chain of service, dependence, and hope. And when the night fell, and the valley darkened beneath the stars, the land itself seemed to breathe, resting, waiting, and remembering the endless rhythm of hands and seasons that gave it life. Part 5. Peasants of the Fields. Before the sun has risen, before the first bell from the church calls the faithful to prayer, a faint light appears at the edge of the sky. A rooster crows somewhere in the distance, and another answers across the valley. In the dim gray of dawn, the peasants of the manor rise from their straw beds. Their world is small, bounded by fields, woods, and the seasons, yet it contains everything they know and everything they will ever need. The life of a peasant is built around the land. It feeds, defines, and confines them. Their cottages stand close together along a dirt road that leads toward the fields. Smoke rises from thatched roofs as fires are lit to warm the morning air. Inside, families share a meal of dark bread, perhaps with a little cheese or a thin broth. Children wake shivering, pulling on woolen tunics, patched and mended many times over. There is no clock to command the hour, only the light of the sky and the rhythm of the seasons. To live as a peasant is to live within time, not against it. The year unfolds like a great wheel turning steadily through the ages. Spring brings plowing and sowing. Summer demands ceaseless work to weed and tend the growing crops. Autumn is harvest, the most important, exhausting season of all. Winter is the quiet interval, a time for repair, storytelling, and prayer. Each month has its duty, each week its place in the pattern. When the men and women leave their cottages, they carry the tools of their lives. Wooden plows tipped with iron, sickles, hoes, baskets woven from reeds. The earth beneath their feet is damp and cold, but familiar. It is soil their ancestors have worked for generations, and each family knows its shape and moods as one might know a friend. The peasants work not only for themselves, but for the lord of the manor. The best land, the lord's Demesne, must be tilled before they can tend their own small strips. They owe him days of unpaid labor, known as week work, as well as part of their harvest. Some pay rent in grain or livestock, others in service, repairing roads, cutting timber, or carrying messages. Though bound by duty, they find dignity in skill. A good plowman is respected, a careful reaper admired. In the open fields, there are few fences. The land is divided into great sections, one for spring crops, one for autumn, and one left fallow to rest. Each family holds narrow strips scattered among the fields, ensuring that no one has only poor soil or too much of the good. The work is communal. Neighbors labor side by side, helping one another through sickness or storm. When a plow breaks, others lend their oxen. When a harvest is plentiful, they share the ale. The days are long, stretching from first light until dusk. The sun moves slowly across the sky as the peasants bend and lift, sow and reap, always watched by the bailiff or reeve who records their service to the manor. Yet there is rhythm and peace in their labor. The steady crunch of feet in the soil, the sound of wind through the wheat, the murmur of voices across the field, all blend into a single living heartbeat that has pulsed for centuries. Around midday, they pause for rest. Meals are simple: bread, onions, ale, sometimes a bit of salted meat if fortune allows. They sit in the shade of hedges, wiping sweat from their brows, sharing stories of weather, births, or rumors from nearby villages. Children chase one another between furrows, laughing despite hunger or dirt. The earth stains everything, but the people hardly notice. It is part of them. In the evenings, the world softens. Tools are gathered, oxen led back to the barns, and the sky glows with the deep colors of sunset. The peasants return home tired but alive. Inside their cottages, the hearth provides warmth and light. The walls are made of wattle and daub, sticks plastered with mud, and the floors are often packed earth. There is one main room with a small loft for sleeping. Smoke curls upward through a hole in the roof. The smell of stew fills the air, a mix of barley, cabbage, and herbs from the garden. Children eat first, then curl up near the fire. Parents speak quietly, mending clothes or carving wooden handles for tools. The room flickers with orange light. Outside, owls call from the trees, and the distant castle bell marks the passing hours. This is the heart of peasant life. Not grand, not free, but enduring. Their days are governed by faith as much as by labor. Every morning and evening they cross themselves and murmur prayers taught by the village priest. Sunday is sacred. Work ceases, and the people gather in the small stone church at the center of the village. Inside, the air smells of wax and incense. The priest's Latin words are mysterious, but his gestures are clear. The people kneel, heads bowed, finding comfort in the familiar ritual. The sermon, spoken in their own tongue, reminds them that obedience and patience will be rewarded in the next life. Religion shapes their understanding of everything. The rhythm of the year follows the church's calendar as closely as the turning of the seasons. Lent brings fasting and reflection. Easter brings celebration. Saints' days punctuate the months with processions and feasts. When harvest ends, they thank God in a festival of color and song, dancing around bonfires and sharing what little they have. For one night, laughter fills the fields, and even the poorest forget their burdens. Though peasants work for others, they maintain a quiet pride in their craftsmanship. The blacksmith, the carpenter, the weaver, and the brewer each hold vital roles in the village. Their skills keep the manor alive. A well-made cart, a sharpened plow, a strong pair of shoes, these are treasures. The community depends on one another in ways that go beyond obligation. When illness strikes, neighbors care for the sick. When a roof collapses, others help rebuild. Survival depends on cooperation more than strength. The peasant's relationship with the Lord is complex. He is both protector and master. His soldiers guard the roads, and his granaries may save them in famine, yet his taxes and demands weigh heavily. A good lord is remembered with gratitude, a cruel one with bitterness that lingers for generations. But open defiance is rare. Fear of punishment and faith in divine justice keep rebellion at bay. Most peasants accept their lot as part of the natural order, trusting that God sees their labor and their pain. Children grow quickly in such a world. From the age of 7 or 8, they join their parents in the fields, herding animals, gathering firewood, or scaring birds from crops. Few learn to read or write, but they know the land intimately, when to plant, when to reap, when the soil will turn. Their knowledge is passed down, not in books, but in gestures and memory. Illness and injury are constant threats. A simple wound can turn deadly. The village healer, often an old woman skilled with herbs, mixes salves and teas from the plants she gathers along the hedgerows. Her remedies are trusted as much as the priest's prayers. Death is familiar, but not feared. It is part of the cycle, as natural as harvest or snowfall. Graves are dug beside the churchyard wall, where families visit to light candles and leave flowers of the season. Despite hardship, the peasants' lives hold moments of quiet beauty. In spring, the air fills with birdsong and the scent of blossoms. In autumn, the low sun turns the fields to gold. Even in winter, when hunger presses and the nights are long, the world glows with the comfort of firelight and song. Inside every cottage, there is laughter, gossip, and the telling of old tales, of saints, dragons, and faraway kings. Storytelling keeps hope alive. The peasant's world is small, yet not without wonder. Traveling merchants bring spices, fabrics, and news from distant towns. A wandering minstrel might stop at the village green, singing of heroes and wars long past. Pilgrims on their way to holy sites pass through, their cloaks dusty and eyes bright with faith. For a moment, the villagers glimpse the wider world, though few will ever see it themselves. At harvest time, the entire community gathers in the fields from sunrise to sunset. The work is immense, cutting, binding, and carrying sheaves to the barn. Songs rise to keep the rhythm, sweat darkens the cloth on their backs, and the air smells of crushed grain. When the last sheaf is brought in, a feast is held. The Lord may provide ale or meat in gratitude. Lanterns hang from trees, and music fills the air. For one night, the distance between master and servant narrows. But when winter comes, life slows. Snow covers the ground, and smoke from hearths curls into the cold air. Men mend tools. Women spin wool and patch clothing. The village grows quiet, except for the barking of dogs and the tolling of church bells. Hunger can be severe in these months, especially after a poor harvest. Families share what they have, stretching grain and root vegetables until the thaw returns. In those dark weeks, faith and companionship matter more than ever. The cycle of generations continues without pause. Children grow into adults who take their parents' places in the fields. Old age comes early. Few live beyond 40 or 50 years, but the community endures. The same names are spoken again and again in baptisms and burials. The land holds their footprints, their sweat, and their memories. To modernize, peasant life may seem harsh and joyless, but within its limits it offered meaning and order. Each person knew their place and purpose. Their work connected them to something larger than themselves, the turning of the seasons, the will of God, the life of the land. They lived close to nature, and though they had little, they belonged entirely to the earth that sustained them. As night falls over the village, the last fires die down. The moon rises, silvering the rooftops. In the distance, the castle stands silent against the stars. The peasants sleep, their muscles heavy from labor, their dreams filled with fields and sun and the faint promise of tomorrow. The world is still. In the quiet darkness, one can almost hear the heartbeat of the medieval countryside, steady, patient, eternal. Part 6. The Manor Kitchen and the Hall. In the feudal world, food was more than sustenance. It was a language of power, faith, and community. What people ate, where they ate, and with whom they ate revealed their place within the great hierarchy that ruled every part of life. To walk through the manor's kitchen and the Lord's hall is to see how the very act of eating reflected the order of the medieval world. The kitchen of a manor was a world apart, filled with heat, smoke, and movement. Long before sunrise, servants stirred the fires, breaking kindling to feed the great hearth. The air smelled of wood smoke and damp stone. Copper pots hung from hooks on blackened beams, their surfaces shining in the flicker of firelight. Wooden tables were crowded with knives, ladles, and earthen bowls. Nearby, a great block served as a butcher's table, stained from years of work. At the center of all this stood the cook, a figure of both skill and authority. Often trained in another noble household, he knew how to prepare dishes that pleased his lord and impressed guests. His assistants worked in silence, chopping herbs, plucking fowl, and stirring thick stews that simmered slowly through the morning. The rhythm of the kitchen was unending. There were always mouths to feed, not only the family but also knights, servants, and travelers seeking hospitality. Outside, in the manor courtyard, messengers arrived with provisions. A wagon might bring sacks of grain from the Demesne fields, barrels of ale from the brewhouse, or baskets of onions and garlic from the gardens. Hunters returned from the forest carrying deer or wild boar slung over their shoulders. Their catch would be hung in the cool shadows of the larder, where salted meat and smoked fish already lined the walls. Nothing was wasted, for food was wealth as much as gold. The manor was largely self-sufficient. Bread came from the lord's own mill, cheese from his herds, honey from his hives. Vegetables and herbs grew in enclosed gardens near the kitchen door, leeks, cabbages, parsley, mint, and thyme. The scents of these plants mingled with the constant smoke from the hearths, creating a perfume both humble and comforting. By mid-morning, the kitchen reached its full rhythm. Fires roared beneath spits where whole animals turned slowly, dripping fat into the flames. Servants basted the meat with spiced wine or vinegar, using bundles of herbs as brushes. Nearby, another fire burned beneath an iron cauldron where porridge bubbled, thick and savory. The sound of knives against wood, the hiss of hot pans, and the murmur of voices blended into a single music of labor. The food prepared here was not only for nourishment, but for display. The manor's reputation rested on its hospitality. A generous table showed that the lord was wealthy, civilized, and favored by God. To serve fine dishes was to demonstrate power, to transform raw grain and meat into abundance. When the cooking was done, the dishes were carried through arched doors into the great hall, the heart of the manor's social life. The hall was vast and smoky, warmed by a central fire whose smoke rose to the rafters before escaping through a hole in the roof. Sunlight filtered through narrow windows set high in the wall, glinting on armor and tapestries. The scent of roasting meat followed the servants as they entered, balancing platters and pitchers. At one end of the hall stood the high table, raised on a dais beneath a carved canopy. Here sat the lord and lady, their children, and important guests. Beneath them stretched long trestle tables for the household, knights, squires, clerks, and retainers, each arranged by rank. At the far end sat servants and workers close to the door. Even in eating, the feudal order was visible. Everyone had a place, and that place seldom changed. Before the meal began, a short prayer was spoken. Servants poured water into silver basins for hand washing, passing them down the line. Then the feast began, and the hall filled with sound. Voices rose in greeting, goblets clinked, and the scrape of knives on wooden trenchers echoed under the beams. For the lord and his guests, the meal was an event of ceremony and taste. Platters arrived in procession, roasted fowl glazed with honey, stews thick with herbs, fresh bread steaming from the oven. The wealthiest tables might see delicacies such as venison, eel, or imported spices from the east. Each course was served with care. Wine and ale flowed freely, carried by pages who moved quickly between the benches. Further down the hall, the fare was simpler: bread, cheese, vegetables, and pottage, a thick soup made from grains and beans. Yet even this was generous compared to the meager meals of peasants outside the manor walls. Here, under the protection of the lord's roof, everyone shared in the comfort of abundance, however briefly. As the meal continued, entertainment filled the hall. A minstrel plucked at his lute, singing of ancient battles and noble deeds. A jester performed tricks or told humorous tales to lighten the mood. Between courses, the steward announced each new dish, often with exaggerated ceremony. A roasted peacock might be brought out, feathers restored and gilded beak gleaming, not to eat, but to admire. Feasting was theater, a performance of wealth and stability. The noise and light of the hall created a sense of warmth that extended beyond hunger. In winter, when the winds howled outside and the nights came early, the hall's fire became the heart of the manor's life. People gathered there to talk, to plan, to rest. It was the center of communication and celebration, of justice and welcome. Letters were read aloud, travelers were questioned, and news from distant lands was shared. Above all, the hall was a place of community. Though ranks divided the tables, the shared meal united the household under one roof. The servants who worked unseen in the kitchen could take pride in the spectacle their labor produced. The lord, in turn, was reminded of his duty to provide, to nourish, and to protect. The act of feeding others was both practical and sacred, an echo of the divine command to care for those under one's charge. After the meal, the hall quieted. Leftover bread and bones were gathered into baskets for the poor who waited by the gate. The fire burned lower, its light turning from gold to red. The lord might withdraw to his private chamber, while his steward checked the stores to plan for the next day. In the kitchen, servants washed dishes in wooden tubs, scrubbing them with sand and ash. The day's work ended only when the last embers faded. Outside, beyond the castle walls, the contrast was stark. In peasant cottages, dinners were humble affairs: a bowl of pottage, some bread, a little ale. Meat was rare, reserved for feast days. Yet even in poverty, there was gratitude. Families prayed before eating, just as nobles did, giving thanks for whatever had been provided. The difference lay not in faith, but in fortune. The ingredients that filled noble kitchens told the story of a connected world. Spices like cinnamon, pepper, and cloves came from Asia through long trade routes, reaching Europe at great expense. Sugar was a rare luxury, used sparingly in sweets and sauces. Almonds, raisins, and figs came from the Mediterranean, bringing with them the taste of distant sunlit lands. To serve such foods was to show not only wealth but reach, proof that the lord's influence extended beyond his own fields. For all their splendor, noble meals were not purely indulgent. The church set strict rules on fasting and abstinence. On Fridays and during Lent, meat was forbidden, replaced by fish or vegetarian dishes. The cook had to adapt constantly, creating variety within the limits of faith. In this way, religion tempered appetite and reminded even the wealthy that abundance was not license. The hall itself reflected that balance. Though built for display, it also served justice and worship. On certain days, the lord held court there, hearing petitions and settling disputes. On others, a priest might say mass before the high table, transforming feasting space into sacred ground. The same fire that warmed celebrations also lit solemn vows. Late at night, when the hall emptied, its silence held echoes of the day. The laughter, the music, the clatter of dishes, the faint scent of roasted herbs still clinging to the air. Servants swept the floor with straw brooms, leaving the flagstones clean for morning. Above them, the banners stirred gently in the drafts. The manor kitchen and the hall were the twin hearts of feudal life, one devoted to labor, the other to display. Together, they mirrored the entire society that surrounded them, the toil of the many sustaining the comfort of the few, bound together by duty and belief. The heat of the kitchen was the hidden strength behind the glow of the feast. For the peasants who worked the fields, the distant glow of the manor's fires was a sign that their labor had value. For the lords who dined beneath carved ceilings, the taste of bread and ale was a reminder of the earth and the people who made it fertile. Between them flowed the exchange that defined the age: service and protection, labor and reward, dependence and gratitude. As midnight approached, the last of the embers faded. The kitchen slept, its pots polished and its fire cold. The hall stood empty, its long tables bare. Yet both would awaken with the dawn, repeating the same cycle that had governed generations before. And when the first light crept through the narrow windows, smoke would rise once again from the kitchen hearth. The rhythm of fire and hunger, work and feast would begin anew, the timeless heartbeat of the manor echoing across centuries of faith, duty, and sustenance. Part 7. The Church above all. In the world of feudal Europe, there was one institution that towered above kings and knights, above lords and peasants alike. It was older than any dynasty, stronger than any army, and present in every valley, village, and castle. It was the church, and to the people of that age, it was not only a building or a belief, it was the structure of the universe itself. The church gave meaning to life's hardships, explained the mysteries of nature, and promised hope beyond death. It stood as the bridge between heaven and earth, a presence both comforting and commanding. To understand life under feudalism, one must understand that everything from birth to burial passed through the hands of the church. At dawn, the first sound that reached the countryside was often the ringing of a church bell. It marked the beginning of prayer, the opening of the day, and the reminder that all human activity unfolded under the gaze of God. Peasants in the fields, nobles in their chambers, monks in their cloisters, all heard the same sound and paused, if only for a heartbeat, to cross themselves and remember their place in the divine order. The smallest villages had their own parish church, often built of rough stone with a single bell tower. Its walls were thick, its windows narrow, and inside it was cool and dim. The scent of candle wax and incense lingered in the air. The priest, sometimes the only educated man in the area, stood as both shepherd and judge, healer and messenger. He baptized children, blessed marriages, heard confessions, and buried the dead. Through him, villagers felt the presence of God in their daily lives. Every major event was marked by ritual. When a child was born, it was brought to the church to be baptized with holy water, washing away original sin. Without baptism, the soul was believed to wander outside salvation. When two people married, it was before the altar that they made their vows. When life ended, the priest came again, sprinkling holy water over the grave, committing the body to the earth and the soul to eternity. From the cradle to the coffin, no one walked outside the reach of the church. For peasants, faith was woven into the rhythm of labor. They prayed for good weather, for healthy crops, for the safety of their families. The church calendar shaped their year as much as the seasons did. Feast days and fasting days broke the monotony of work. Saints' festivals filled the air with song and color. On such days, the fields lay quiet while people gathered to celebrate with processions, music, and shared meals. Even in poverty, joy was found through worship. Inside the parish church, the faithful gazed at images painted on wooden panels or carved in stone. Few could read, but the art spoke clearly. Scenes of the crucifixion, the saints, the angels, and the fires of hell. These images were not decoration. They were lessons. Through them, the church taught obedience, humility, and the promise of redemption. Heaven was a garden of light. Hell was a pit of darkness. Between them lay the narrow road of virtue, and the priest was the guide. For the nobility, the church was both spiritual authority and political partner. Kings sought its blessing to legitimize their rule. Lords endowed monasteries to cleanse their souls and strengthen their reputations. The higher clergy, bishops, and abbots often came from noble families, wielding both wealth and influence. Their cathedrals rose like mountains of stone, dominating the towns that grew around them. To step inside a medieval cathedral was to feel the scale of faith made visible. Light poured through stained glass windows, painting the floor in red and blue. Columns rose like trees, and arches soared toward the heavens. Every stone, every carving was a prayer in physical form. The sound of chanting filled the space, echoing endlessly through the vaults. To the people who knelt on its cold floor, the cathedral was proof that heaven touched earth. Yet the church was not a single, silent entity. It was a vast network of monasteries, convents, and abbeys, each playing a role in the life of the age. In remote valleys or high on hills stood the monasteries, self-contained worlds devoted to prayer and work. Monks followed the rule of Saint Benedict, rising before dawn for matins, chanting psalms in candlelight, and tending fields or copying manuscripts by day. Their motto was ora et labora, pray and work. Within those cloisters, knowledge was preserved through centuries of turmoil. The monks were the keepers of books, the guardians of history, and the quiet laborers who kept learning alive when much of Europe lay in ruin. Their gardens grew herbs for medicine, their scriptoria filled shelves with handwritten texts, and their bells marked the rhythm of divine time. The peace of the monastery stood in contrast to the chaos of war and famine beyond its walls. For women, the church offered both limitation and refuge. Convents gave noble daughters an alternative to marriage and offered education rarely found elsewhere. Within their walls, women prayed, studied, and served the poor. Some became scholars, artists, or even abbesses who ruled their communities with quiet authority. Yet the church also defined strict boundaries for women's roles, praising obedience and chastity above all. To be holy was to be humble, and to serve was to find salvation. Faith was not a choice. It was the air people breathed. The church taught that every action had eternal consequence. The 7 sacraments, baptism, confirmation, confession, communion, marriage, holy orders, and anointing of the sick, formed the milestones of life. Through them, grace flowed from God into the human world. To live outside the sacraments was to risk damnation. But faith was not always gentle. The same institution that offered comfort also wielded fear. The threat of excommunication, being cast out of the church, could destroy lives and kingdoms. A ruler denied the sacraments was seen as cursed. His subjects could be released from loyalty. The church's power reached far beyond the altar. It shaped laws, diplomacy, and war. Even kings trembled before the papal seal. Still, for most people, religion was a source of solace, not terror. The church's festivals brought color to the grayness of toil. The ringing of bells marked moments of grace amid the struggle of survival. On long winter nights, villagers gathered in the church to hear stories of saints and miracles. The warmth of candlelight, the echo of hymns, and the smell of incense created a sense of safety that nothing else could provide. Tithes, the 1/10 tax owed to the church, were collected in every manor. Peasants might grumble, but they paid, knowing that the church fed the hungry, cared for the sick, and offered burial to all. The parish priest was more than a spiritual leader. He was also the keeper of records, the mediator of disputes, and often the only link between the village and the wider world. When disaster struck, famine, plague, or war, people turned instinctively to prayer. They saw suffering not as injustice, but as part of God's plan. Processions filled the roads, candles in hand, voices lifted in song. The church provided not explanations, but endurance, transforming fear into ritual and despair into hope. In the noble courts, Religion shaped the rhythm of politics. Before battle, knights took communion, believing it cleansed their souls for whatever might come. When a castle was built, its first completed room was often the chapel. When treaties were signed, they were sealed with oaths sworn before relics of saints. Even rebellion needed the language of faith. To defy a lord or a king was to claim divine right. The wealth of the church grew immense. Monasteries owned vast lands, bishops advised monarchs, and cathedrals glittered with gold. Yet the church also carried the burden of conscience. Preachers reminded the rich that their fortune was a trust from God, not a toy for indulgence. Pilgrimages became acts of purification, journeys of penance to holy places where relics and miracles offered spiritual renewal. The roads to Santiago, Canterbury, and Rome filled with travelers carrying staffs and prayers. For many, heaven felt near. They believed the saints watched from above, that angels guarded their sleep, and that each soul could find mercy through confession. Death was not an end, but a passage. The church taught that beyond this life lay judgment, purgatory, and finally paradise. To live well was to prepare for that journey. As night fell over medieval Europe, the church's presence remained constant. Bells tolled for Compline, the final prayer of the day. Candles flickered before statues of the Virgin Mary. Monks in distant abbeys chanted softly as peasants in their cottages whispered evening prayers. Across the continent, millions of voices rose together, blending into a single sound of faith. To live under the church's shadow was to inhabit a world where the visible and invisible met. The fields, the castles, and the monasteries all formed parts of the same divine order. The church gave that order meaning, reminding rich and poor alike that their labor, their joy, and their sorrow all flowed toward the same eternity. Even centuries later, when power shifted and faith fractured, the memory of that unity would linger. A time when every sunrise began with bells, and every heart found its rhythm in the prayers that bound the earth to heaven. Part 8. Knighthood and Chivalry. When people today imagine the Middle Ages, they often see a figure on horseback, a knight in shining armor, his banner fluttering, his sword glinting in the sunlight. But behind that image lies a more complex reality. The knight was not merely a warrior. He was the embodiment of an entire way of life, one built on loyalty, courage, faith, and the long discipline of training. To understand the knight is to glimpse the soul of the feudal world. The path to knighthood began early. Sons of nobles were destined for arms almost from birth. At the age of 7, a boy was sent away from home to live in another lord's household, beginning his education as a page. It was an apprenticeship in both courtesy and endurance. He learned to serve before he could command. His days began with prayers in the chapel and ended with lessons in manners, music, and scripture. He carried messages, tended horses, and assisted in the great hall during meals. Though he was of noble blood, his rank meant nothing yet. In the household, humility was the first lesson of knighthood. The page's duties were many. He fetched armor, poured wine, and stood silently beside his master during audiences. He watched knights spar in the courtyard, studying their movements with awe. When the horn sounded for the hunt, he followed on a smaller horse, learning to track and to ride. His world smelled of leather, steel, and the forest, a mixture of discipline and excitement that filled every day with purpose. By the age of 14, a boy became a squire, stepping closer to the title of knight. The transition marked a new stage of service. He now cared for a specific knight, cleaning his armor, sharpening his sword, and tending his horse. The bond between squire and knight was personal and sacred, mirroring the feudal oath between lord and vassal. The squire learned not only the art of war, but also the values that were meant to guide it: loyalty, generosity, and restraint. Training was harsh. The squire practiced swordplay, lance work, and wrestling. He rode for hours, learning balance and control. He studied how to bear the weight of armor, sometimes more than 60 pounds, until it became part of his body. Bruises, cuts, and exhaustion were constant companions, yet discipline forged strength, and strength forged pride. Beyond skill in battle, a squire was taught the code of chivalry, a moral framework that defined how a knight should live. It demanded bravery in war, fairness in judgment, and courtesy in peace. A true knight was to defend the weak, honor women, keep faith with his lord, and serve God above all. In theory, it was a perfect harmony of courage and virtue. In practice, it was an ideal few could fully achieve. When the time came for knighting, the ceremony was both solemn and sacred. On the eve of the ritual, the squire kept vigil in a chapel, dressed in white, fasting and praying through the night. His sword lay upon the altar, blessed by the priest. At dawn, he confessed his sins and took communion. Then, before his peers and his lord, he knelt. The Lord touched his shoulder with the flat of a sword and spoke the words that made him a knight. "In the name of God, Saint Michael, and Saint George, I dub thee knight." Trumpets sounded, and the hall erupted in celebration. The new knight rose, no longer a servant, but a sworn protector of the realm. His armor gleamed, his horse bore his family's colors, and his oath bound him to a life of service and war. In peace, a knight's life centered on the manor and the tournament field. Tournaments were both sport and preparation for battle. Elaborate displays of skill where knights tested their courage before cheering crowds. The tilt-yard echoed with the thunder of hooves and the clash of lances. Spectators waved ribbons and banners as the best warriors competed for honor and prizes. The danger was real, injuries and deaths were common. Yet for the knight, glory was worth the risk. Between tournaments, knights managed their lands, trained their retainers, and served as the muscle of the feudal order. When their lord called, they answered. A knight's loyalty was absolute. His armor, weapons, and horse were his badge of identity. To lose them in battle was shame. To abandon his post was dishonor. The armor itself was a marvel of craftsmanship, forged by blacksmiths who shaped steel into curved plates fitted to the body. Beneath it, the knight wore a padded garment called a gambeson to absorb impact. Over the armor, he displayed his colors and emblem, a lion, a cross, or a star, marking his lineage. Every detail told a story. When he mounted his horse, shield on arm and sword at side, he carried not only his own name but the reputation of his family. The knight's weapons were symbols as much as tools. The sword represented justice and faith. It was blessed in the same way as a relic. The lance symbolized courage and reach, a weapon of both ceremony and battle. The dagger was personal, a last defense if all else failed. Each blade was kept sharp and polished, often engraved with prayers or the names of saints. Yet for all its splendor, knighthood was not as romantic as legend suggests. War was brutal. Campaigns meant long marches, poor food, and constant danger. A knight might fight for his lord's cause, but also for his own survival. Battles were chaotic. Clouds of dust, screams of horses, and the metallic crash of bodies colliding. Victory brought honor, but also death and grief. The ideals of chivalry tried to soften this reality. They preached mercy toward the defeated and respect for fellow Christians. A captured noble was often ransomed rather than killed. But not all wars followed these rules. When fighting turned to plunder or rebellion, the knight's code could give way to cruelty. The gap between the myth of honor and the truth of violence was wide. Still, knights saw themselves as guardians of order in a dangerous world. They defended castles, escorted pilgrims, and protected roads. Their presence symbolized stability in a time of uncertainty. To peasants, the sight of a knight in armor could mean safety, or fear, depending on his allegiance. To his lord, he was the backbone of power. The Church sought to direct this warrior spirit toward holy ends. In the 11th century, it created the Peace and Truce of God, movements that limited when and whom knights could fight. Violence was forbidden on Sundays and holy days, Attacks on women, priests, and the poor were condemned. Later, the church offered a greater mission, the Crusades. Knights were promised salvation if they took up the cross and fought in distant lands. The idea of the Christian warrior reshaped knighthood. To fight for faith was seen as the highest calling. Many went willingly, seeking glory and forgiveness. They crossed seas to battle in deserts and foreign cities, driven by a blend of piety and ambition. Some returned home rich and honored. Others never returned at all. The Crusades left both scars and legends that lasted for centuries. At home, the ideals of chivalry grew into a culture of courtly love and refined manners. Troubadours sang of noble ladies and faithful knights who served them from afar, their love pure and unattainable. Castles became centers of art and poetry as well as war. The sword and the harp shared the same hall. For the upper class, chivalry was both discipline and performance, a code of behavior meant to distinguish them from the roughness of common life. The daily routine of a knight balanced between devotion and duty. Mornings began with prayer in the chapel, followed by training or patrol. Meals were eaten with their retainers, and evenings were spent in conversation, music, or study of strategy. When called to arms, they left without hesitation, answering the summons of loyalty that defined their existence. Despite the glory associated with their rank, knights were always aware of the fleeting nature of power. Armor rusted, banners faded, and fortunes changed. A single defeat could erase years of honor. Many found solace in faith, turning to monasteries in old age, exchanging their swords for prayer books. Some founded chapels or endowed churches as acts of gratitude or repentance. Even in death, the knight's tomb showed his dual nature, a warrior carved in stone, hands folded in eternal prayer. The legacy of knighthood was complex. It upheld ideals of courage, service, and respect, yet it also preserved violence and hierarchy. Knights were both protectors and enforcers, poets and killers. They stood at the intersection of faith and war, embodying the contradictions of their age. At dusk, when the training yard fell silent and the last light touched the towers, the knight might walk alone through the castle courtyard. The clang of metal faded into the hum of evening insects. He would look out across the fields, seeing smoke from peasant cottages curling into the sky. In that moment, the distance between them seemed vast. Yet both lived under the same order, the same faith, the same chain of duty and dependence. As the stars appeared, he might kneel in the chapel, his sword laid before the altar, whispering the same prayer spoken by countless others before him, for strength, for honor, and for forgiveness. For all his armor and power, the knight remained a man bound by the same web of obligations that defined the age. His courage, his discipline, and his faith were not his alone. They were threads in the vast tapestry of feudal life, shining, fragile, and eternal. Part 9. Women of the Feudal World. In the long centuries of feudal life, women lived within a web of expectations as strong and unyielding as the stone of the castles that overshadowed their fields. They were mothers and daughters, wives and widows, nuns and laborers, bound by the same rhythms of duty and faith that ruled all of society. Yet their experience was shaped by quiet endurance, by strength carried in silence. The world of the Middle Ages was ordered by hierarchy and belief, and within that order, women's roles were clearly defined. The church taught that man was the head of the household, just as Christ was the head of the church. Women were to be obedient, chaste, and humble. Yet within these boundaries, they found ways to exercise power, sometimes openly, often through patience and wisdom. In the halls of the nobility, a woman's life was one of both privilege and confinement. The noble lady lived in the castle, surrounded by servants, musicians, and the constant presence of duty. Her days began with prayer in the chapel, followed by the management of the household. She supervised kitchens, storerooms, and laundries, ensuring that food, linen, and supplies were abundant. Every loaf of bread, Every candle, every bolt of cloth that entered the castle passed through her oversight. In her lord's absence, and men were often away at war, she ruled the estate. She received petitions, dispensed charity, and managed accounts. Her signature might appear on charters and letters, her word carrying the weight of her husband's seal. Though she could not sit in council or lead armies, her influence was undeniable. The smooth running of the manor often depended on her intelligence and resolve. The ladies' chamber was the center of this quiet authority. Within its walls, she met with stewards, instructed servants, and taught her daughters the skills they would need to manage their own households one day. She also oversaw the education of pages and young girls from noble families sent to her care, teaching them reading, music, embroidery, and the etiquette that marked their rank. The scent of beeswax and lavender filled the air, the soft hum of conversation mingling with the scratch of a quill or the rhythm of a spinning wheel. Marriage for noble women was rarely a matter of love. It was an alliance, arranged to bind families, secure land, or cement peace between rival lords. Betrothals were made when girls were barely into their teens. The ceremony, grand and sacred, joined two estates as much as two souls. Yet within these unions, affection sometimes grew. Letters from the period speak of tenderness, of shared prayers, and the sorrow of separation. In other marriages, duty remained the only bond. Motherhood was both joy and peril. Childbirth was dangerous, and many women did not survive it. Yet it was also their highest calling. Sons continued the family line, daughters extended it through marriage. Each birth strengthened the household's future and confirmed the woman's value in the eyes of her world. When a husband died, a noble widow could inherit lands and manage them independently, sometimes wielding great influence as guardian for her heirs. Widows were respected, and some became powerful in ways denied to younger women. Beyond the castle walls, the lives of peasant women followed a different rhythm, one of unending labor. From dawn until night, they worked beside their husbands in the fields, tending crops, animals, and children. They carried water from wells, gathered firewood from forests, and spun wool into thread. Their hands were rough from work, their backs bent from carrying burdens, yet their strength held the village together. In the peasant cottage, a woman's day was filled with motion. She kneaded dough in wooden troughs, stirred pots over smoky hearths, and patched worn clothing by the light of a small fire. Children clung to her skirts, and infants slept in cradles near the warmth of the embers. The air smelled of bread, ash, and herbs hung to dry. Despite hardship, the home she kept was a place of comfort, a small circle of stability in a harsh world. Peasant women also took part in community life. They joined in harvests, sang in festivals, and gathered herbs for healing. Some served as midwives or wise women, drawing on generations of knowledge to treat illness and ease childbirth. Though the church often viewed such practices with suspicion, these women were essential to their neighbors' survival. Their skill and compassion gave them a quiet authority that no title could bestow. Education was rare for most women, but not entirely absent. In convents and noble households, girls learned to read prayers, write simple letters, and understand the scriptures. Some noblewomen became patrons of learning, supporting poets and scribes. Queens and abbesses could read Latin, manage estates, and correspond with bishops and kings. Within the church, nuns held roles of unusual influence. Life in a convent offered an alternative to marriage. For noble daughters without dowries, or for widows seeking peace, it was a place of sanctuary and purpose. Behind its walls, women lived by the rhythm of prayer, work, and study. The abbess governed the community like a lord governed a manor. She managed land, collected rents, and maintained correspondence with powerful figures. Convents copied manuscripts, educated girls, and provided medical care to the poor. The nuns' days began before sunrise. The bell called them to matins, the first of many prayers. By candlelight they chanted psalms, their voices rising and falling in the stillness of dawn. Later, they worked in the gardens, the infirmary, or the scriptorium. The scent of parchment and ink filled the air as careful hands traced words in Latin. For some, this quiet devotion was liberation, a life of the mind and spirit far removed from the world's demands. But the Church's teachings also confined women. It upheld the Virgin Mary as the model of perfect womanhood, pure, obedient, and maternal, yet often used that ideal to measure and control real lives. Eve's sin, the priests reminded them, had brought suffering into the world. Therefore, women must remain humble. Sermons urged modesty and warned against vanity. A woman's virtue was her shield, her reputation, her survival. Despite these constraints, women found ways to assert their presence in the story of their time. They built hospitals, founded religious orders, and shaped politics through family alliances. Queens like Eleanor of Aquitaine and Blanche of Castile ruled territories, led armies, and negotiated with kings. Their intelligence and resolve challenged the belief that leadership was a man's domain. Even ordinary women left their mark. In marketplaces, they sold butter, cloth, and bread, sustaining local trade. In towns, they ran workshops alongside their husbands or continued them as widows. Guild records show female brewers, weavers, and midwives, women whose labor helped build the very fabric of medieval society. Their contributions were often unrecorded, yet without them, the feudal world could not have endured. Love, too, existed within this structured life, though often quietly. Troubadours sang of courtly affection, of knights serving ladies beyond their reach. These songs, while idealized, reflected a growing respect for women's gentleness and intellect. Within marriages and communities, affection found small but lasting expressions: a shared look, a simple gift, a prayer spoken for another's safety. The presence of women was felt in every season. During harvest, they worked side by side with men, laughing as they bound the sheaves. In winter, they spun wool beside the fire, telling stories to their children. At funerals, it was women who keened, their voices carrying grief across the fields. In every joy and sorrow, they were the keepers of memory. At night, when the village slept and the castle gates were closed, a woman might step outside to look at the stars. She would see the same sky as her ancestors, the same constellations guiding sailors and pilgrims alike. Perhaps she whispered a prayer for her family, or for strength to face another day. Her life was small in the eyes of history, but immense in its quiet purpose. The legacy of these women endures, not in monuments, but in the invisible thread of continuity they wove through generations. They fed the hungry, raised the living, mourned the dead, and taught the next generation to endure. The feudal world was sustained as much by their unseen labor as by any sword or sermon. As dawn came again and the bells of the church began to ring, women across the land stirred from their beds, noble and common, young and old. They dressed, prayed, and returned to their work. Life continued through their hands, through their patience, and through their faith. Though history often spoke the language of kings and knights, it was women who gave that history its rhythm, a steady pulse of compassion and endurance that outlasted empires and echoed quietly through the centuries. Part 10. The Village and the Market. If the castle was the heart of feudal power, and the church the soul of faith, then the village was the living body of the medieval world. It was where the rhythm of daily life pulsed most clearly, in the voices of laborers, the ringing of hammers, and the laughter of children chasing geese along muddy lanes. Within its boundaries, centuries passed almost unnoticed. The same paths were walked, the same bells rang, and the same markets gathered beneath the same sky. To enter a medieval village was to step into a world shaped by necessity and habit. The houses stood close together, built from wattle and daub with thatched roofs and small shuttered windows. Smoke curled from holes in the roof, carrying the scent of burning oak and peat. Chickens wandered freely, and dogs dozed by doorways. The air was alive with sound, the crack of an axe, the creak of a cart, the murmur of voices calling greetings. At the village's center stood the green, a patch of open land where animals grazed and markets were held. Nearby rose the stone church, its bell tower visible for miles around. Beside it stood the manor house or hall, where the lord's steward oversaw the affairs of the estate. Beyond stretched the open fields, divided into strips that every family worked in common. Beyond those fields lay the woods, where villagers gathered firewood and herbs, careful to respect the lord's rights to hunt and timber. The village was more than a cluster of homes. It was a community bound by shared labor. Every task was collective. Plowing, sowing, and harvesting were done together, and every family's work affected the rest. When one farmer fell ill, his neighbors helped with the fields. When a cottage caught fire, the whole village brought buckets from the well. There was hardship, but also solidarity. Survival demanded cooperation. Each household had a small garden for vegetables and herbs, and a few animals, a pig, some chickens, perhaps a cow or goat. These provided food through the year, but they were also part of the family's life. Children grew up feeding and herding them, learning early that every creature had its purpose. The rhythm of feeding, milking, and collecting eggs shaped the hours between fieldwork and rest. In the evenings, when work ended, villagers gathered on the green or in the tavern. The tavern was often a simple room with rough tables and benches, but it was the center of conversation and gossip. There, under the flicker of tallow candles, they shared ale brewed from barley grown in their own fields. Laughter rose easily, songs filled the air, and the worries of the day melted into warmth and companionship. But once a week, or once a month depending on the region, something different stirred the village: the arrival of the market. On those mornings, before the sun rose, traders began to appear on the roads, their carts heavy with goods. The sound of wheels on stone echoed across the valley, announcing a day unlike any other. The market transformed the village from a quiet farming community into a lively crossroads of trade and color. Stalls were set up on the green or near the churchyard. Bright fabrics hung from wooden poles, glinting in the light. The smell of bread, cheese, and roasted meat filled the air. Merchants called out prices, their voices mingling with the chatter of buyers. Chickens clucked in cages, and the bleating of sheep mixed with the sound of laughter and haggling. For many peasants, the market was their only glimpse of the wider world. Traders brought goods from distant towns, salt from the coast, iron tools from the smiths of the city, spices from lands so far away their names sounded like prayers. Coins changed hands, though barter was still common. A farmer might trade eggs for a pot or a bundle of wool for a knife. The market was as much about connection as it was about commerce. Here, ideas traveled as easily as goods. News of wars, famines, or royal decrees spread through conversation. A peddler might tell tales of distant lands, of cathedrals rising in France, or pilgrimages to holy shrines. For villagers who rarely traveled more than a few miles from home, these stories widened the horizon of imagination. The market was a doorway to a larger world, one filled with wonder, danger, and endless curiosity. Alongside the traders worked the craftsmen, the blacksmith, the carpenter, the tanner, and the miller, each essential to village life. The blacksmith's forge was never silent for long. Its heat glowed red through the night as he shaped plowshares, nails, and horseshoes with practiced rhythm. The hammer's ring carried through the air a steady heartbeat of creation. The carpenter built carts and repaired doors, his workshop smelling of pine and shavings. The tanner worked by the stream, curing hides in vats that gave off a sharp, unpleasant odor. Every craft had its sound, its scent, and its pride. The miller held special importance. His watermill or windmill turned endlessly, grinding the grain that sustained the manor. The sound of the millstones was the sound of survival. Peasants brought their wheat and barley to him, paying a portion of the flour as his fee. Though sometimes mistrusted for his wealth, the miller's skill made him indispensable. Without him, no bread could be baked, no feast prepared. At larger markets or fairs, entertainers arrived, jugglers, musicians, and storytellers. They drew crowds with songs and tricks, offering laughter in a world that rarely paused. Children watched wide-eyed as a juggler tossed knives or a minstrel sang of knights and saints. For a few coins, a crowd could forget hunger and hardship, caught in the magic of performance. The fair became not only a marketplace, but a festival of life. Over time, these markets grew into towns. Some villages, blessed by good location or royal favor, expanded into bustling centers of trade. Stone walls replaced hedges, and wooden houses gave way to shops and guild halls. Merchants banded together for protection, forming guilds that set standards of quality and price. The hum of commerce began to rival the tolling of church bells. This slow rise of towns marked a quiet transformation in feudal society. Where the village tied people to the soil, the town offered a glimpse of freedom. Craftsmen could earn wealth through skill rather than inheritance. Serfs could escape their bondage by living within town walls for a year and a day, the custom known as town air makes free. The marketplace that once belonged to the manor's rhythm became the seed of a new world built on trade and movement. Yet in the age of feudalism, the village remained the foundation of life. Its people measured time not by profit, but by the turn of the seasons. They knew the scent of rain on plowed earth, the comfort of shared bread, and the satisfaction of seeing their children grow strong in the same fields their ancestors had tended. Their world was small but complete. The village church watched over it all. On market days, its bell rang to mark the hour of prayer, calling merchants and buyers to pause. Priests reminded them that even trade was part of God's design, that fairness and charity must govern the exchange of goods. After the market ended, villagers gathered again on Sundays to hear the same bell call them to Mass. Faith and trade, soul and soil, all intertwined beneath its sound. As dusk fell on market day, the crowds thinned. Merchants packed their goods, farmers led their animals home, and children carried small treasures, a ribbon, a sweet, or a toy carved from wood. The air grew still again, the ground littered with straw and footprints. Smoke rose from the cottages as fires were lit, and the village returned to its quiet rhythm. The sound of a distant mill turned steady in the night. For the people of that world, the village and the market were more than places. They were symbols of continuity. Within their simple patterns lay the pulse of medieval life, a life of toil and patience, but also of fellowship and faith. The market brought color to the gray of routine, and the village bound that color into the fabric of everyday survival. When morning came again, the fields awaited, the animals called, and the bell rang anew. The people of the village rose to meet another day, their hands rough, their hearts steady. They worked, they traded, they prayed, just as their ancestors had done, and as their children would do after them. And so the story of the medieval world continued, written not in the halls of kings, but in the quiet persistence of villages and the humble exchange of goods beneath open skies. Part 11. Law and Punishment. In the medieval world, order was as fragile as glass. A poor harvest, a wounded pride, or a stolen sheep could ignite feuds that spread through families and fields alike. Feudalism promised stability, but it was a human system, and humans needed rules. To live within the web of obligations that held lord and peasant together, there had to be law, and behind that law, the ever-present shadow of punishment. Yet justice in the Middle Ages was not what we would recognize today. It was not a system of written codes and distant courts. It was something closer, more personal, and more immediate, rooted in custom, in the authority of the local lord, and in the moral guidance of the church. In this world, law was less a matter of rights than of balance, and punishment was less about guilt than about restoring harmony. Every manor had its own court, usually held in the great hall beneath the lord's roof. The walls that echoed with feasts and music on holy days also echoed with the solemn murmur of disputes. When the court day arrived, villagers gathered, some in their best clothes, others in work-worn tunics, still dusted with earth. The steward or bailiff presided if the lord was absent, sitting on a high chair with a record book open before him. Disputes could be small, arguments over a boundary, unpaid rent, or a wandering pig that destroyed a neighbor's crop. The reeve, chosen from among the peasants, often spoke on behalf of the village. Witnesses were called, oaths were sworn before the cross, and the steward listened carefully, weighing both evidence and reputation. Justice was local, but it was taken seriously. A man's good name was often his most precious possession. The punishments in such cases were practical rather than cruel. A fine might be paid in grain or livestock. A thief might be made to work for the victim until restitution was complete. Shame was a punishment of its own. Standing before one's neighbors to confess a fault was a public humiliation few forgot. In these small judgments, the goal was not vengeance, but peace. The village had to go on living together once the court was done. For more serious crimes, theft, arson, assault, or murder, justice reached higher. These were felonies, judged not by the manor court, but by the king's justices or by the lord's higher authority. The process was slow, uncertain, and steeped in ritual. The idea of evidence was limited. People believed that God's hand guided truth, and that divine will could reveal guilt or innocence in miraculous ways. This faith gave rise to the ordeal, one of the most striking features of medieval law. There were several kinds, each designed to let God decide the outcome. In the ordeal of hot iron, an accused person had to carry a piece of glowing metal for several paces. The wound was then bandaged and left for 3 days. If it healed cleanly, it was said that God had shown mercy. If it festered, guilt was proven. In the ordeal of cold water, the accused was bound and lowered into a river or pond. If he sank, he was innocent, for the water, symbol of purity, accepted him. If he floated, he was guilty, rejected by the sacred element. Many feared the test itself more than the crime's punishment, for in every ordeal there was risk, pain, and chance. Yet for centuries, people trusted the results without question. The church blessed these rituals, but also moderated them. Priests prayed over the fire or the water, asking God to reveal the truth. To them, the ordeal was not superstition, but a visible act of divine judgment. Over time, however, church authorities grew uneasy. In the 13th century, the ordeal was largely abandoned, replaced by juries and written testimony. But in the heart of the feudal era, it was seen as the truest form of justice, a bridge between heaven and earth. Lesser punishments could still be harsh by modern standards. A thief might be placed in the stocks, his feet and hands locked in wooden boards on the village green. There, under the gaze of his neighbors, he endured public scorn until released. Children jeered, women scolded, and men passed without sympathy. Shame was meant to cleanse as much as to wound. More dangerous criminals faced execution, though this was rare within a small manor. Hanging was the usual sentence for murder or repeated theft. In towns where crime was harder to control, punishment could be theatrical. The condemned were paraded through the streets before the gallows. The act served as both warning and reassurance, a demonstration that order still prevailed. The church's courts, meanwhile, offered a different kind of justice. They dealt with spiritual offenses, adultery, heresy, blasphemy, and disputes over marriage or wills. These courts did not use ordeals or executions, but relied on confession and penance. A sinner might be ordered to fast, to make a pilgrimage, or to donate to the poor. The church claimed the soul as its domain, and its punishments aimed to purify rather than destroy. This dual system, secular and sacred, created a delicate balance. The Lord upheld worldly peace, while the church guarded moral order. At times, their powers clashed. A priest accused of crime could claim the benefit of clergy, escaping the Lord's court for trial under church law. To the peasantry, such complexities were distant. They knew only that justice came from above, and that both the sword and the cross carried authority. For common people, the law was both protector and threat. It offered safety from chaos, but could also seem arbitrary. A poor man stealing bread to feed his family might face the same charge as a bandit. Mercy depended on the character of the Lord or the mood of the steward. Still, most peasants accepted the system as part of the divine order. Just as God ruled heaven, so the Lord ruled earth, and punishment was seen as correction rather than oppression. Honor played a central role in how justice was perceived. For the nobility, disputes were often settled through trial by combat. Two men would meet in a fenced field, armed with swords or maces, and fight until one yielded or fell. Victory was proof of righteousness, defeat a sign of guilt. Though brutal, it reflected the same belief that God guided the outcome of every struggle. The clash of steel replaced the voice of a judge. The fear of crime shaped daily life. Villages were small, and everyone knew one another, so theft and violence were rare. But when a crime occurred, it echoed loudly. A stolen sheep, a burned barn, or a broken oath could disturb the fragile peace of an entire community. Justice was swift not only to punish, but to remind everyone of the boundaries that kept their world intact. Beyond punishment, the law also defined responsibility. Each man was part of a tithing group, 10 households bound to ensure each other's good behavior. If one member committed a crime and fled, the others were responsible for bringing him to justice or paying a fine. In this way, order was maintained not just by authority, but by mutual watchfulness. The system tied everyone together in shared accountability. Despite its harshness, the medieval concept of justice was deeply moral. It sought to maintain balance between sin and forgiveness, between harm and restitution. The goal was not reform in the modern sense, but harmony. Every wrongdoing was seen as a disruption of divine order, and every punishment as a way to restore it. When court days ended and the villagers left the manor hall, life returned to its rhythm. The accused returned to work, the fines were paid, and the community closed around the wound like healing skin. The law's purpose was fulfilled when the fields were peaceful again, when people could sleep without fear of retribution. In the quiet that followed, the hall returned to warmth and laughter. The same hearth that had watched stern judgment now glowed with friendly light. The lord, the priest, and the villagers might share ale and bread, their disputes momentarily forgotten. In a world where survival required unity, forgiveness was as necessary as punishment. As dusk settled over the manor, torches flickered along the road. A bell tolled from the church tower, calling for evening prayer. Inside the cottages, families whispered blessings before sleep, asking for safety and peace. The law, in all its forms, stern, flawed, and sacred, had done its work. It is easy, looking back, to see only the cruelty of the age, but beneath it lay a desire for order and fairness, born from fear of chaos. The people of that time believed that justice was not merely human invention, but a reflection of the divine. To them, every judgment echoed in eternity, and every act of mercy shone like light through the cracks of a dark world. In that belief, the medieval system found its endurance. Harsh though it was, it kept the fragile web of feudal life from tearing apart, a web made of oaths and obligations, of faith and fear, held together by the shared hope that balance could be restored, and that peace, however brief, could return to the land. Part 12. Castles and Sieges. The stone castle stood as both protector and prize. To those who lived within its walls, it was a fortress of safety. To those who marched against it, it was an obstacle to ambition. In the feudal world, the castle was more than architecture. It was the beating heart of warfare and the ultimate symbol of power. A mountain built by human hands to withstand both time and enemy. Each castle was unique to its land and age, but all shared the same purpose. They were built to command the landscape, to see far and to endure. Rising above valleys or guarding river crossings, their towers were the eyes of their lords, watching for friend and foe alike. The stones, quarried from nearby hills, were laid by craftsmen whose work would outlive generations. The walls were thick, the gates narrow, and the towers round to deflect siege weapons. Moats glimmered around them, filled with water or sharpened stakes. Inside lay courtyards, workshops, storerooms, and stables, an entire world enclosed in stone. From afar, a castle appeared silent and eternal, but within it was always alive, with footsteps, hammer blows, and the distant echo of voices calling orders across the battlements. In times of peace, The castle was a place of ceremony and routine. Its great hall hosted feasts, its chapel echoed with prayers, and its garrison trained in the yard. But peace was always temporary. The medieval world lived with the constant shadow of conflict, small wars between rival lords, raids from across borders, or rebellions of desperate peasants. And when war came, the castle's true purpose revealed itself. News of danger often arrived first as rumor, a messenger galloping through the gates, breathless, bearing word of an approaching army. The air changed instantly. The drawbridge rose, the gates were barred, and horns called men from fields and villages. Within hours, the castle became a fortress in truth. The preparations for siege were swift and exact. Food was gathered, grain, salted meat, barrels of ale, and smoked fish. Livestock were driven inside the walls. Water cisterns were checked, weapons sharpened, and armor polished. Women and children from nearby farms took refuge within, their faces tense with fear and hope. Space grew crowded, but the walls promised safety. At dawn, from the highest tower, the garrison could see dust rising on the horizon, the enemy drawing near. Soon, banners appeared, bright in the morning sun. Drums sounded, horns echoed, and the siege began. Outside the walls, the attacking army spread across the fields like a tide. Tents were raised, fires lit, and engines assembled. The most feared of these were the siege weapons, machines of wood and iron designed to break what man had built to last. Catapults hurled stones the size of mill wheels, shaking the ground with every strike. Trebuchets, vast as houses, used counterweights to send boulders crashing against the walls with deep, thunderous rhythm. Inside, the defenders answered with arrows and boiling oil, with stones rolled from parapets, and with prayers whispered in the chapel below. Each impact sent dust falling from the ceilings, each tremor made hearts tighten. The air filled with smoke and dust, the smell of pitch and burning wood. Days turned into weeks. The rhythm of the siege was relentless. Attack, repair, watch, and wait. The defenders slept in armor, ate in haste, and listened for the creak of enemy engines at night. Archers stood on the ramparts in silence, scanning the fields by torchlight. In the kitchens, fires burned low as food grew scarce. Bread was rationed, water guarded. The sound of the draw well became sacred, the sound of survival. For the people inside, siege life was as much endurance as fear. The Lord moved among his men, offering words of courage. The priest led prayers for deliverance. Children hid in storerooms, their mothers calming them with stories of saints and heroes who had endured worse. At night, the chapel glowed with candlelight as soldiers knelt before the altar, shadows flickering across the stone walls. They prayed not for victory, but for the dawn to come again. Outside, the besiegers faced hardships of their own. Rain turned their camps to mud. Disease spread through the ranks. The longer the siege lasted, the more the attackers suffered. Armies needed food as much as courage, and supply lines stretched thin. Sometimes an army would camp for months, only to retreat in failure when winter came. But when the attackers were determined, they turned to cunning and construction. Miners dug tunnels beneath the walls, shoring them with timber and then setting fires to collapse the stone above. Engineers built siege towers, tall wooden structures on wheels covered with hides soaked in water to resist fire. From these towers, archers rained arrows onto the defenders while soldiers tried to leap across to the battlements. For the defenders, every day became a test of patience and skill. The walls were patched with timber and clay, the breaches filled as fast as they were made. The carpenter worked beside the soldier, the cook beside the archer. Everyone, high or low, played a part. When the enemy grew close, the clash was fierce. Stones, arrows, and fire flew through the air. The cries of the wounded mingled with the roar of the engines. Smoke rose like storm clouds, and the sky turned gray with ash. Yet even in the chaos, there was discipline, a rhythm of duty that kept fear at bay. Inside the castle, life shrank to essentials. The hall that once hosted feasts became a hospital. Straw covered the floors, and the air smelled of sweat and blood. The wounded lay side by side, knights and peasants alike, bound together by shared suffering. The chaplain moved among them, offering comfort, anointing the dying with oil, whispering prayers over their fading breaths. As weeks passed, food dwindled. Rats and grain husks became meals. Leather was boiled for soup. Hunger hollowed faces and made tempers short. Yet still, the walls held. Hope rested on the chance of relief. Another army, a loyal ally, or simply the exhaustion of the enemy. Sometimes that hope came. One morning, the besieged might hear the sound of distant horns and see banners on the horizon, reinforcements arriving. The attackers would break camp, smoke rising from their fires, and retreat into the distance. Cheers would echo from the walls, and the bells of the chapel would ring until their cords frayed. Other times, no help came. When the gate finally broke and the attackers poured in, the world became noise and flame. The defenders fought room by room, knowing there would be no mercy. Women and children hid wherever they could, in cellars, in chapels, behind the heavy doors of storerooms. The castle that had stood so proud became a place of terror. Yet even in defeat, there was meaning. The fall of a castle was never just the loss of stone. It was the end of an age, the turning of fate. For every wall that crumbled, another rose elsewhere, stronger and wiser. The builders learned, and the cycle of construction and destruction continued, as constant as the changing of seasons. When peace returned, the castle would be rebuilt. The scars of war were patched with new mortar, the gates repaired, the walls raised higher. In time, laughter returned to the hall, music to the courtyard, and prayer to the chapel. Life persisted, as it always did, between the ruins and the rebuilding. For those who lived within such walls, the memory of siege never left. They carried it in the silence that fell at night, in the sound of rain on stone, in the way they stored food against unseen famine. The castle was not only a monument to strength, but a reminder of fragility, that even the thickest wall depended on the courage of those who stood behind it. As evening came, and the long shadows of the battlements stretched across the fields, the castle returned to stillness. The drawbridge rested over calm water, the torches burned low, and the wind whispered through the arrow slits. Somewhere, deep within the chapel, a single candle flickered before the cross, a sign of gratitude for survival and peace. The castle, guardian of the land and witness to its suffering, stood as it always had, silent, watchful, waiting for whatever tomorrow might bring. Part 13. The Plague and the Cracks in the System. For centuries, the world of feudalism seemed unshakable. The land was divided, the oaths were sworn, the churches stood tall, and life moved according to its ancient rhythm. Each person knew their duty and their place. Kings ruled, lords governed, peasants toiled, and the church blessed it all. It was a world that believed itself eternal. But even the strongest systems crack, and sometimes the first fractures appear not through swords or rebellions, but through hunger, fear, and the invisible hand of disease. The 13th and 14th centuries brought change, slow at first, like the shifting of the wind, then swift and merciless. Crops began to fail. Winters grew longer, rains heavier, summers colder. The Great Famine of the early 14th century swept across Europe, killing millions. Grain rotted in the fields and livestock perished from cold and sickness. Peasants boiled bark and weeds for food. The air was filled with the smell of decay and the sound of hunger. The famine struck at the very heart of feudal order. A lord's wealth depended on the harvest, and when the land yielded nothing, his power faltered. Peasants fled their fields in search of food, villages emptied, rents went unpaid. The great web of obligation began to tremble. Yet even this suffering did not prepare the world for what was coming next. A disaster so vast that it would tear the fabric of medieval life apart. It began, as great catastrophes often do, with whispers. Travelers spoke of a strange sickness spreading from the east, a sickness that killed whole cities. Ships arrived in Mediterranean ports carrying not only goods but death itself. In the year 1347, the Black Death reached Europe. Within months, it swept across the continent like a dark tide, unstoppable and unseen. The disease moved faster than rumor. Fleas carried it, rats spread it, and people carried it unknowingly from town to town. No wall was high enough, no moat wide enough to stop it. In crowded cities, the air grew thick with the stench of death. In quiet villages, the bells of the church tolled until there was no one left to ring them. Symptoms came without warning: fever, black swellings in the armpits and groin, pain beyond bearing. Few survived more than a few days. Priests, doctors, and healers could do little but pray. The sick were abandoned by fear-stricken families. The healthy fled the dying, and entire communities vanished. The plague respected neither rank nor virtue. Lords and peasants, monks and knights, all met the same fate. For the people of that age, it was more than a disease. It was judgment. Many believed that God had turned his face away, punishing the world for its sins. Processions of penitents walked barefoot through towns, whipping themselves in repentance, begging for mercy. Priests preached of the end times, while others blamed outsiders, strangers, or the powerless. Fear bred hatred as much as sorrow. And yet, amid the horror, acts of courage shone quietly. Some priests stayed to bury the dead when others fled. Monks tended to the sick within monastery walls, knowing they would likely die themselves. Neighbors shared what food they had with those left behind. In a world drowning in despair, small lights of humanity still flickered. When the plague finally passed, perhaps half of Europe's people were gone. Empty fields stretched for miles. Villages lay in silence, their doors swinging open to the wind. The land itself seemed haunted. But from that emptiness came a transformation no one had expected. With so many dead, labor became precious. Fields needed workers, and there were few left to till them. Peasants discovered a new power, the power to demand better wages, lighter duties, and freedom from the burdens that had chained them for centuries. Some left their lords' manors to seek work elsewhere. Others refused to serve under the old conditions. For the first time, the rigid bonds of feudalism began to loosen. Lords, desperate to restore order, tried to force the peasants back into submission. New laws fixed wages and forbade travel without permission. But hunger for freedom had already taken root. Across Europe, rebellions flared, brief, fierce, and unforgettable. In England, the Peasants' Revolt of 1381 saw common laborers march toward London, crying out for justice and the end of servitude. They demanded equality under God, their voices rising like thunder over the fields. Though the revolts were crushed, their spirit lingered. The memory of defiance could not be unlearned. Each generation after the plague carried a little more restlessness, a little less reverence for the old hierarchies. The divine chain of being, once seen as eternal, had begun to rust. The church, too, felt the strain. So many priests had died that villages were left without spiritual guidance. Some saw this as proof that the church's power was failing. Others turned to personal faith, seeking God in solitude rather than ceremony. The plague had broken not only the body of society, but its heart. The once unquestioned authority of church and Lord began to waver. In towns, trade slowly revived, carried by survivors eager to rebuild. Markets grew busier, and the merchant class, those who lived by commerce rather than the land, began to rise in importance. Gold, not birth, started to decide power. The merchant guilds of the cities became as influential as lords of the countryside. With them came new ideas about freedom, labor, and wealth, ideas that would one day reshape Europe entirely. But in the years immediately after the plague, the mood was one of exhaustion. Survivors lived with grief like a second skin. The world they had known was gone, and what replaced it felt uncertain. Art and prayer turned toward death and redemption. painters filled churches with images of skeletons and hourglasses, the dance of death, reminding all that no rank or title could escape mortality. In monasteries, monks wrote quietly of what they had seen. They described towns where grass grew in the streets and ships drifting at sea with no living crew. They tried to understand why God had allowed such suffering, but their answers were few. The plague had taught them that the world could change in an instant, that nothing was as stable as they had believed. The peasants who returned to their fields found strange peace in the silence of the earth. They plowed over the graves of those who had fallen, sowing new crops where bones still lay beneath. Each seed was a small act of defiance against despair. Slowly, the rhythm of the seasons returned. Spring followed winter, as it always had. But the air carried a new weight, the knowledge of fragility and of life's preciousness. The feudal order did not collapse overnight, but its foundations were weakened beyond repair. Lords found their authority questioned, the church its sanctity doubted, and kings their divine right tested. Out of this turbulence, new forces would rise: trade, cities, nations, and a growing sense of individuality. The old world was fading, and something new was stirring in its place. Still, for those who lived through it, the change felt less like revolution than survival. They buried their dead, rebuilt their homes, and prayed for calm. In their quiet resilience, they carried the memory of both suffering and endurance, a testament to the human spirit that refused to vanish even when half the world had fallen silent. At dusk, in the years after the plague, a lone bell might still ring from a small village church, its sound carrying across empty fields. Fewer voices answered it now, but those who did sang with deep, trembling faith. They sang not only for the dead, but for the living, for the fragile hope that life would continue. And it did. Slowly, patiently, the earth healed. New generations were born who had never known the darkness of the plague years. They tilled the same soil, prayed in the same churches, and rebuilt the same walls. But beneath their calm world ran the memory of what had been lost, and the quiet knowledge that even the mightiest order could fall. The cracks in the system had opened, and through them, the first light of a new age began to shine. Part 14. The Age of Change. The old world of feudalism did not vanish in a single moment. It faded slowly, like the sound of a distant bell, lingering in the air long after its echo should have died. What replaced it was not yet the modern world, but a bridge toward it, a new rhythm of life born from survival, trade, curiosity, and the slow awakening of the human mind. By the end of the 14th century, Europe was restless. The great catastrophe of the plague had shaken its foundations, but from ruin came renewal. The population, once decimated, began to rise again. Fields were cleared, towns rebuilt, and abandoned villages reclaimed by those bold enough to start anew. Yet the society that reemerged was not the same. The land still belonged to lords, but power was shifting, quietly, steadily, into new hands. In the countryside, peasants had changed. They were no longer the voiceless laborers of centuries past. Their work was vital, their absence devastating, and they knew it. Lords who once demanded unpaid labor now found themselves bargaining for it. Many peasants began to pay rent in money rather than service, freeing themselves from the endless cycle of obligation. The manor court, once the center of local power, slowly lost its grip as the cash economy took hold. This shift gave birth to something new: mobility. Families who had been tied to the same fields for generations began to move. They followed work, opportunity, and the growing hum of towns. Roads once used by pilgrims and soldiers now carried merchants and travelers. The old feudal bond between man and land was loosening, replaced by a bond between skill and trade. The towns were the beating hearts of this transformation. Within their walls, life pulsed with energy unknown in the stillness of rural fields. Narrow streets wound between tall timbered houses, their upper floors leaning toward one another as if whispering secrets. Shop signs creaked in the wind, and the air was thick with the smell of baking bread, tanned leather and burning pitch. Bells rang from towers, calling craftsmen to work and marking the hours of commerce. Each town had its own rhythm. At dawn, markets filled with farmers selling produce and fishermen offering their catch. Merchants unpacked goods from distant lands, fine cloth from Flanders, spices from Venice, wine from France. The sound of haggling rose like music, and the clatter of carts echoed down cobbled lanes. Here, wealth was not born from inheritance, but from daring, from the courage to buy, to sell, and to risk. The merchants formed guilds, associations that guarded their trade and ensured quality. To join one was to gain both protection and pride. Apprentices worked for years under a master, learning every secret of the craft before earning the right to call themselves journeymen, free to travel and work where they pleased. In time, the most skilled became masters themselves, opening shops and taking on apprentices in turn. The cycle of labor became a path to independence, something the feudal peasant could never have imagined. Wealth in the towns brought influence, and influence demanded voice. Across Europe, kings began to recognize that the merchants' gold could strengthen their crowns. They granted charters to towns, giving them the right to govern themselves, collect taxes, and hold courts. In return, the towns supported the crown against rebellious lords. Slowly, a new balance of power emerged, kings and townsmen against the feudal nobility. Trade did more than build fortunes, it connected people. Ships sailed farther than ever before. The Mediterranean linked to the Atlantic, the Baltic to the English Channel. Markets once confined to villages now stretched across oceans. With each voyage came new ideas of freedom, knowledge, and the vastness of the world. At the same time, the church, once unquestioned, faced growing challenges. The plague had shaken faith in its authority, and corruption within its ranks had darkened its image. Yet even as its power wavered, learning and faith began to flourish in new forms. Monasteries became centers of scholarship. Universities rose in Paris, Bologna, and Oxford. There, young men studied law, philosophy, and the natural world, guided by curiosity rather than fear. A quiet revolution was beginning, not in weapons, but in thought. The rediscovery of ancient Greek and Roman writings, preserved by scholars in the East, inspired new ways of seeing the world. People began to believe that reason could uncover truth, that the human mind could explore creation as boldly as a sailor explored the sea. This renewal of knowledge gave rise to art and invention. Painters learned to shape perspective, making images come alive with light and depth. Architects built cathedrals that seemed to float on air, their arches reaching toward heaven. Engineers tinkered with gears, mills, and printing presses, laying the groundwork for the coming centuries. It was the beginning of what would later be called the Renaissance, a rebirth of vision, born from the ashes of the old order. But not everyone shared in this progress. For many in the countryside, life still followed the slow pace of the seasons. They sowed, reaped, and prayed as their ancestors had done, their worlds little touched by the city's wealth. Yet even there, the sense of change was felt. The Lord's word no longer carried the same weight. The world beyond the manor no longer seemed unreachable. Knights, once symbols of feudal glory, found their role fading. Warfare itself was changing. Longbows, gunpowder, and disciplined infantry replaced the old image of armored cavalry. The thunder of cannons echoed where swords once ruled. The castle walls that had seemed eternal could crumble in a single day under the force of artillery. The age of stone fortresses was giving way to the age of nations. And nations were growing. Kings, strengthened by trade and taxation, began to consolidate their realms. France, England, Spain, each gathered its regions under a single crown, replacing the scattered loyalties of feudal lords with centralized power. Royal courts grew more sophisticated. Laws became uniform. Armies stood ready not for personal glory but for the state. The concept of nationhood was being born. For ordinary people, these changes brought both promise and uncertainty. Opportunity came with risk. Wealth could be earned, but also lost. Old securities vanished as freedom expanded. The church still offered salvation, but reason whispered new questions. The world was widening, and with it, the human spirit. In towns and cities, the hum of printing presses began to spread words faster than sermons could contain them. Books once copied by monks over years could now be made in weeks. Ideas traveled like seeds carried by the wind, ideas of dignity, discovery, and reform. Though the feudal system still lingered in parts of Europe, its authority was quietly being written away. Through all this change, one thing remained constant: the endurance of ordinary people. They still woke to the sound of bells, still tilled the earth, still prayed for good harvests. But their place in the world had subtly shifted. They were no longer bound by unbreakable chains of birth and service. A man might dream of travel, a craftsman of mastery, a scholar of truth. The world was no longer only a hierarchy, it was a horizon. By the 15th century, Europe was stirring from its long medieval sleep. The streets of Florence buzzed with painters and philosophers. The markets of Bruges overflowed with fabrics and silver. Ships from Portugal and Spain set sail toward unknown seas, guided by stars once thought unreachable. The courage to question, to seek, and to build had become the new measure of greatness. And yet, in the quiet corners of the countryside, traces of the old world remained. The manor on the hill, the peasant's cottage, the tolling church bell marking time as it always had. These remnants were not relics, but roots. The age of feudalism had shaped Europe's soul, its values. Duty, faith, community would not vanish but evolve, forming the foundation on which the modern world would rise. As the 15th century drew to a close, the last true lords of feudal Europe looked out from their castles and saw a world changing before their eyes. The roads were busier, the towns louder, and the people bolder. The wind carried the scent of new lands and the promise of invention. The future was coming, unstoppable and vast. In the halls where knights once feasted and priests once preached submission, new voices were beginning to speak. Voices of merchants, thinkers, and explorers who saw the world not as fixed, but as something to be discovered. The age of change had arrived. The stone towers of feudal power still stood, but their shadows were growing shorter. Across the continent, a light was rising, the dawn of a new age born not from conquest, but from curiosity, courage, and the quiet endurance of those who had survived the darkest of times. Part 15. The Legacy of Feudalism. When the echoes of the Middle Ages began to fade and the world stepped cautiously into the dawn of the modern era, the age of feudalism seemed to sink quietly into the past. Its castles became ruins overgrown with ivy, its titles softened into ceremony, its once rigid hierarchies loosened, scattered by trade, invention, and thought. Yet even as the world changed beyond recognition, the essence of feudal life did not vanish. It endured, hidden in the foundations of laws, in customs, and in the deep memory of human community. Feudalism had been, above all, a structure of survival. In a world fractured by war and invasion, it gave shape to chaos. Lords offered protection, peasants offered labor, kings ruled by divine right, and the church sanctified every oath. The land was the source of everything, of power, of food, of identity. The system worked not because it was fair, but because it was necessary. For nearly 1,000 years, it bound Europe together, turning wild frontiers into kingdoms, and kingdoms into cultures. As centuries passed, this order became more than a system of governance. It became a way of seeing the world. Every person was part of a chain that reached from earth to heaven, from serf to knight to king to God. Within that vision, meaning was found in obedience, in service, and in faith. The smallest act of labor was believed to reflect divine purpose. To plow a field was to honor creation. To rule justly was to mirror the authority of heaven. The world of feudalism moved slowly, measured by seasons rather than clocks. It valued endurance over innovation, duty over ambition. Its people built not for profit, but for permanence. Cathedrals meant to last forever. Monasteries meant to echo with prayer long after their founders were gone. Though its constraints were many, its stability gave birth to beauty. The quiet strength of stone walls, the patient rhythm of rural life, and the deep devotion of faith all grew from that same soil. When feudalism began to weaken, it did not fall with a crash but eroded gradually, like a cliff worn by waves. The rise of towns and trade, the awakening of thought, and the discoveries of new worlds slowly unstitched the old tapestry. Yet every new age carried threads of the old one. The concept of loyalty between ruler and subject, commander and soldier, endured. So did the idea of service as honor. Even as modern governments replaced personal oaths with laws and institutions, the moral fabric of duty remained. In every later generation of soldiers, officials, and workers, echoes of the knight's code could still be heard. Courage, integrity, and the promise to protect those who cannot protect themselves. The church, too, though changed by reform and reason, continued to shape the soul of Europe. The monasteries that once preserved learning gave birth to universities. The cathedrals that lifted eyes toward heaven still stand, their spires piercing the modern sky. They remind the living that beauty and faith can outlast power. From the peasant's endurance came the roots of resilience, the quiet dignity of those who labor unseen, the understanding that society depends on the hands of many, not the will of a few. Their patience, passed down through centuries, became the hidden foundation of later revolutions. The desire for justice, for fairness, for the recognition of every person's worth, all began in the soil once turned by their plows. The language of law still carries feudal traces. Words like tenant, estate, and bond reach back to medieval fields and manors. Even modern contracts echo the feudal oath, an agreement sealed by trust, obligation, and mutual benefit. The idea that power comes with responsibility, that rulers must serve as well as command, first took shape in those distant centuries. But perhaps the greatest legacy of feudalism lies not in its institutions, but in its imagination. It gave the world its first enduring stories of loyalty and courage, the tales of knights, kings, and commoners bound by honor and faith. These stories became the foundation of Europe's mythology. From Arthur and his Round Table to the chansons of Charlemagne's paladins, the values of service and sacrifice shaped not only literature, but the very idea of heroism. Even now, the archetype of the noble knight, flawed yet striving for virtue, lives on in books, films, and dreams. Yet the system that birthed these ideals also left shadows. Feudalism's hierarchy taught obedience, but also inequality. It sanctified order, but often silenced justice. Beneath the splendor of castles lay the hardship of peasants who labored without rest. For every illuminated manuscript copied in a monastery, countless hands went blistered in the fields. It was a world of faith and endurance, but also of limits, a balance of beauty and suffering that defined the medieval age. When the Renaissance dawned, it carried forward what feudalism had begun, the belief that structure could give rise to creation. Artists, scholars, and explorers built upon the stability the old order had maintained. The tools of measurement, the organization of guilds, and the literacy fostered by monasteries all became the groundwork for discovery. Even in its decline, feudalism prepared the soil for the growth of freedom. The modern world still feels its heartbeat in subtle ways. The relationship between employer and worker, between government and citizen, carries traces of the old bond of service and reward. Titles like Sir, Lord, and Lady still echo in daily speech. Ceremonies of knighthood, long stripped of military meaning, endure as symbols of honor and gratitude. The very idea of a moral duty owed to one's society, of obligation as virtue, descends from the medieval oath. But beyond all these inheritances lies something quieter, something human. Feudalism taught people to find meaning in belonging. It was a world built not on isolation, but on interdependence. Every person, from lord to laborer, relied on others to survive. The peasant needed the smith the knight the priest, and all of them the earth. That sense of shared fate, born from necessity, remains one of history's gentlest lessons. If the modern age celebrates freedom, the feudal age reminds us of connection, that no one truly lives alone, that every community is sustained by trust and cooperation. The manor, the village, and the parish were not just structures. They were networks of care and memory. Though they often confined, they also protected. Within their limits, people forged relationships strong enough to endure famine, war, and plague. Today, the ruins of castles rise above rivers and hillsides, their towers open to the sky. Birds nest where banners once flew. Wind moves through the empty halls where feasts and judgments were held. These ruins do not speak of failure, but of transformation. They are reminders that every order, no matter how vast, must one day give way to change, yet can still leave beauty behind. In the stillness of those ancient stones, one can almost hear the sounds of a vanished age. The distant clang of a blacksmith's hammer, the toll of a church bell across misty fields, the laughter of villagers on a feast day, the chant of monks in candlelight. All of it belongs to a world that believed time itself was part of God's plan, that every sunrise and harvest was sacred, and perhaps that is the truest legacy of all, a sense of continuity. Feudalism taught that life moves in cycles, labor and rest, duty and grace, loss and renewal. Even as it faded, that rhythm endured. It shaped the centuries that followed, whispering through revolutions and reforms, reminding each new age that stability and faith are born from patience. When we look back at that long medieval world, it is easy to see only the distance between then and now. But in its endurance, its humility, and its deep respect for the balance of life, feudalism still speaks softly to the present. It tells us that societies are strongest when they remember both hierarchy and humanity, when power is tempered by care, and when faith, in whatever form it takes, binds people to something greater than themselves. So the story of feudalism does not end with its fall. It continues quietly in the values we keep, in the institutions we trust, and in the invisible ties that hold communities together. The peasants' fields are gone, the knight's armor rusted, the lord's banners long since faded, yet their world remains within us, echoing like an old song carried by the wind. In the twilight of that era, as the medieval sun set behind stone towers and the first light of modern thought began to rise, the people who lived between those ages could not have known what they were leaving behind. But through their endurance, their faith, and their labor, they built more than walls and customs. They built the continuity of civilization itself, the bridge between the ancient and the modern, the known and the possible. And so when we walk through a ruined castle or hear a church bell toll across the countryside, we are not only hearing the past, we are hearing the heartbeat of a world that believed in order, duty, and belonging. Its echoes remind us that every age, no matter how distant, leaves something living behind. Feudalism's legacy is not its hierarchy, nor its chains, but its endurance. The quiet lesson that societies endure not through wealth or conquest, but through the faith of ordinary people who hold to their duties and to one another, even in the darkest of times.